long before any map carried the name Africa, before deserts hardened into barriers and coastlines settled into familiar shapes. The continent was already holding the oldest chapters of the human story beneath its soil. In the north, wind-crossed plains once fed by rivers. In the east, volcanic ash settled over footprints, bones, and abandoned tools. Farther south, caves preserved teeth, fragments of skull, pigments, and traces of lives whose details are almost entirely gone. Tropical forests expanded and withdrew, great lakes filled, shrank, and returned. Grasslands opened where woodland had stood, then closed again as rainfall shifted. Across these changing worlds, ancient hominin populations moved, adapted, separated, met one another, and sometimes vanished. Nothing here resembled a single cradle waiting quietly for humanity to appear. It was larger, stranger, and far more restless than that. Scientists look to Africa because the evidence keeps pulling them there. The oldest known members of the human evolutionary family have been found on this continent. The deepest fossil record connected to upright walking, changing teeth, expanding brains, and early technologies is preserved here. The oldest widely accepted fossils belonging to our own species are African. The genetic diversity found among living African populations is also greater and more deeply structured than that found anywhere else, preserving signals of ancient separations and reunions that reach far beyond recorded history. Fossils, tools, sediments, climates, and genes do not always tell identical stories. Yet together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The long formation of humanity took place primarily within Africa, across an immense span of time and geography. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the mystery is not whether Africa matters. That question has been answered with overwhelming force. The harder question is why this continent became the setting for so much evolutionary experimentation, and why the path toward Homo sapiens unfolded there rather than somewhere else. There is no single cause. Africa was not a machine that inevitably produced modern humans, and evolution was not moving toward a predetermined destination. Species respond to immediate pressures, and most lineages eventually disappear. What survives in the record suggests that Africa offered an unusual combination of time, size, ecological variety, geological activity, and repeatedly changing connections between populations. The continent itself is geologically ancient, giving terrestrial ecosystems long continuity. Yet Africa has never been environmentally still. Tectonic forces open the great rift systems of the east, raising mountains, creating basins, feeding volcanoes, and altering rainfall. Lakes appeared in depressions, rivers changed direction, uplands divided habitats that had once been connected. Stronger monsoons sometimes transformed regions now dominated by desert into grasslands and wetlands, while later dry phases reduced lakes and compressed animals into smaller refuges. These changes occurred again and again, sometimes gradually and sometimes with unsettling speed. For hominin populations, familiar resources could move or disappear within a few generations. Such instability may have rewarded flexibility, but that idea requires caution. Older accounts often presented climate change as a simple machine. Forests vanished, savannas appeared, apes stood upright, and humanity began. The real record refuses to behave so neatly. Early hominins lived in mixed environments, not one uniform grassland. Woodlands, river margins, open patches, lake shores, and forest edges existed side by side. Some anatomical changes may have been useful in several settings at once. Scholars still debate how particular climate episodes influence specific evolutionary developments, and no single environmental explanation fully accounts for the diversity of early hominins. Climate did not press one button and produce bipedalism, toolmaking, or larger brains. It reshaped the possibilities within which many populations struggle to survive. Africa's scale matters just as much as its instability. It is large enough for populations to become isolated, yet connected enough for them to meet again when climates changed. A group separated by desert, forest, or highland could develop distinctive traits. Thousands of years later, a wet corridor might reopen, allowing movement and interbreeding. This rhythm of separation and reconnection may be one of the deepest patterns in human origins. Modern genetic research increasingly suggests that our species did not arise from one tiny population living in one privileged valley. Instead, Homo sapiens may have emerged through a network of populations spread across different parts of Africa, each carrying portions of the anatomical, behavioral, and genetic combination later recognized as modern human. That possibility changes the image of the human birthplace. There may never have been one dawn, one valley, or one founding community. Northern Africa contributes early Homo sapiens fossils and newly recognized populations near the base of our lineage. Eastern Africa preserves long sequences of hominin fossils, tools, volcanic layers, and important early remains of our species. Southern Africa holds caves, archaeological traditions, and genetic histories of exceptional depth. Western and Central Africa remain less visible in the fossil record, partly because tropical soils and humid conditions destroy bone, not because those regions lacked evolutionary importance. A blank area on the fossil map may represent poor preservation, limited excavation, dense vegetation, or decades of unequal research attention. The scientific map has been shaped not only by where ancient people lived, but by where modern institutions chose to search. Famous sites in Eastern and Southern Africa attracted funding, specialists, and repeated field seasons, while immense regions remained underexplored. Recent work in Morocco, Côte d'Ivoire, and other less familiar locations has begun to disturb the old centre of gravity. Fossils from Casablanca around 750,000 years old suggest that northern Africa may preserve populations close to the ancestry of Homo sapiens. Evidence from a tropical forest in Côte d'Ivoire indicates that humans associated with our broader lineage occupied humid woodland around 150,000 years ago, challenging the idea that early Homo sapiens belonged mainly to open grasslands. Living Africans preserve another archive, carried not in stone but in DNA, because only subsets of African populations contributed ancestry to the major migrations beyond the continent. Populations outside Africa contain only part of humanity's older genetic variation. Within Africa, lineages remain diverse, separated, and interconnected across much longer periods. This does not mean any living population is unchanged or closer to an ape-like ancestor. Every living human population is equally modern and has undergone the same amount of evolutionary time. The difference lies in the depth and branching complexity of ancestry. African genomes retain more of the old structure of our species, including traces of population divisions that occurred long before the ancestors of most non-African people expanded into Eurasia. Even this genetic record is incomplete. African populations remain underrepresented in many global genome databases, despite the continent's extraordinary diversity. Ancient DNA is also difficult to recover in hot climates, where genetic material degrades rapidly. New techniques are beginning to recover fragments once thought lost, but major gaps remain. The story is therefore being written from both abundant clues and profound silences. Every fossil site, ancient genome, stone tool, and environmental record can rearrange part of the picture. Africa draws scientists back because it contains not one answer but many overlapping beginnings. The first upright walkers, the earliest known members of Homo, the first technologies, the deep formation of Homo sapiens, and the ecological preparation for later global expansion all emerge from different African settings. The continent was not merely a stage on which humanity appeared. It was a vast, changing system in which many human possibilities were tested over millions of years. Some survived in bone, some survived in genes. Most disappeared without leaving a name. And before scientists could understand that Africa held this immense history, they first had to overcome an older map of human origins, one drawn less by evidence than by expectation. That older map placed humanity almost everywhere except where the strongest evidence would eventually lead. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many European scholars assumed that the first humans must have emerged in Europe or somewhere nearby. The reasoning was often circular. Europe contained famous caves, ancient tools, and well-studied fossils, so Europe seemed central. European museums held the specimens, European institutions controlled the research, and European ideas about progress quietly shaped the questions being asked. Africa was often treated as peripheral, a place where supposedly primitive life had lingered, rather than where major evolutionary change had begun. The fossil record began to dismantle that confidence one bone at a time. In 1924, workers at a limestone quarry near Taung, in what is now South Africa, uncovered a small fossilized skull embedded in rock. The specimen eventually reached Raymond Dart, an anatomist working at the University of the Witwatersrand. What he saw was not a human skull, yet it did not fit comfortably among known apes. The face was young, the brain small, and the teeth unexpectedly human-like in several respects. Most striking was the position of the opening beneath the skull where the spinal cord had entered. Its placement suggested that the head had balanced above a more upright body. Dart named the creature Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa, and argued that it belonged close to human ancestry. The specimen became known as the Taung Child. Its importance is easy to state now, but at the time the claim collided with powerful expectations. Many researchers believed that a large brain must have evolved before upright walking. Taung suggested the opposite bipedal posture could emerge while the brain remained relatively small. It also came from Africa, which many influential scholars had not seriously considered the likely homeland of humanity. The rejection was immediate and often dismissive. Some experts insisted that Taung was merely a young ape. Others considered the skull too juvenile to support major conclusions. The scientific caution was not entirely unreasonable. One small individual could be difficult to interpret. Yet the resistance was strengthened by something less defensible: the belief that human evolution should have begun in a region more familiar to European scholarship. A fossil did not arrive in an intellectual vacuum. It entered a field already crowded with assumptions about geography, anatomy, and human hierarchy. At almost the same moment, a counterfeit fossil from England appeared to confirm those assumptions. Piltdown Man, assembled from a modern human skull and an orangutan jaw, seemed to possess the combination many researchers expected: a large brain with primitive teeth. For decades, this forgery helped preserve the idea that brain enlargement had come first, and that Europe might still hold the earliest human ancestors, Taung, with its small brain and evidence of upright posture, looked inconvenient by comparison. The inconvenience grew as more fossils appeared. During the 1930s and 1940s, Robert Broom and other researchers recovered additional Australopithecine remains from South African cave sites such as Sterkfontein, Kromdraai, and Swartkrans. These fossils included skulls, jaws, teeth, and parts of the skeleton from creatures that were neither modern apes nor modern humans. Some were relatively lightly built, while others possessed enormous chewing teeth and powerful jaw muscles. Their diversity suggested that Africa had once supported several distinct hominin forms, rather than a single transitional species moving neatly toward humanity. The emerging pattern also weakened the claim that Taung was an anatomical accident. Upright walking combined with a small brain was not confined to one juvenile skull. It belonged to a wider group of ancient African hominins. By the time Piltdown was exposed as a fraud in 1953, the old sequence of human evolution had begun to collapse. The supposed English ancestor disappeared from serious science, while the African fossils became harder to dismiss. Attention then moved increasingly toward Eastern Africa, where geology offered an extraordinary advantage. The Rift Valley and surrounding regions contained deep sedimentary basins, volcanic deposits, eroding badlands, and exposed layers spanning immense periods. Volcanic ash could sometimes be dated, allowing fossils and tools to be placed within a more reliable chronology. Here, ancient bones did not merely exist. They could often be connected to environmental changes and specific intervals of time. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, Louis and Mary Leakey spent years searching through layered sediments for evidence of early humans. In 1959, Mary Leakey discovered a robust skull with enormous molars and heavy chewing adaptations. It was initially given the name Zinjanthropus boisei and celebrated as a possible human ancestor, though it is now generally classified as Paranthropus boisei, part of a specialized branch that eventually disappeared. Soon afterward, fossils attributed to early Homo were also found at Olduvai, alongside stone tools and animal remains. The gorge revealed something more complicated than a single ancestral procession. Different hominins had occupied the same broad landscapes, sometimes within overlapping periods, using different biological strategies. Farther north, discoveries around Lake Turkana in Kenya and the Afar region of Ethiopia deepened the record. Fossils attributed to Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, early Homo erectus, and multiple Australopithecine species accumulated across eastern Africa. Some names remain disputed. Some fossils may represent variation within one species rather than separate branches. Scholars still debate how many kinds of early Homo existed and how they were related, yet the larger conclusion became increasingly secure. Africa preserved a long, branching history stretching far beyond the appearance of our own species. In 1974, a team working at Hadar in Ethiopia recovered a partial skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis. The individual became famous as Lucy. Her bones were about 3.2 million years old, and although much of the skeleton was missing, the preserved pelvis, leg, and other elements provided strong evidence of habitual bipedalism. Lucy did not prove that upright walking had begun with her species. Later discoveries would push the story deeper, but she made the strange anatomy of early hominins visible to the public, a small-bodied creature with a small brain, long arms, and a lower body adapted to walking on two legs. Nearby discoveries added further detail. At Litoli in Tanzania, footprints preserved in volcanic ash showed that hominins were walking upright around 3.66 million years ago. The prints captured no dramatic event. A few individuals simply crossed damp ash before another fall of material buried the surface. Yet the ordinary nature of the moment made it powerful. Long before large brains, metal, cities, or even the genus Homo. Upright walkers were moving through East African landscapes. The fossil map continued to expand backward. Ardipithecus ramidus from Ethiopia, dated to around 4.4 million years ago, revealed a creature capable of upright movement but still strongly adapted to climbing. Even older remains attributed to Orrorin in Kenya and Sahelanthropus in Chad pushed possible early hominins towards 6 or 7 million years ago. Their exact positions on the family tree remain uncertain. Sahelanthropus, known mainly from a distorted skull and limited postcranial evidence, has generated continuing debate over whether it walked upright and how closely it relates to later hominins. The evidence remains incomplete. What matters is that the oldest serious candidates all come from Africa. The discovery of Sahelanthropus in Chad also challenged another narrowing assumption, that early human evolution belonged almost exclusively to the Eastern Rift Valley. Chad lies far to the west of the famous East African fossil fields. Its fossils suggested that early hominins may have occupied a much broader portion of the continent than the excavation record once implied. The Rift Valley may appear unusually rich partly because tectonic activity, sedimentation, volcanic dating, and erosion make fossils easier to find there. Other regions may hide comparable histories beneath forests, deserts, or younger deposits. By the beginning of the 21st century, Africa was no longer a speculative candidate for the birthplace of humanity. It had become the only continent with a fossil sequence extending from the earliest probable hominins through multiple Australopithecines, the emergence of Homo, and the early history of Homo sapiens. But this scientific transformation carried an uncomfortable legacy. Many discoveries had been removed, named, and interpreted within colonial systems. African workers and local experts were often essential to finding fossils, yet received little recognition. Research agendas were frequently controlled from abroad, and major specimens sometimes became better known in distant institutions than in the countries where they were found. That imbalance is now being challenged. African researchers, museums, universities, and field teams are increasingly insisting that the continent's deep history must not be treated as raw material for outsiders alone. The question of human origins is inseparable from who conducts the research, who protects the sites, who trains the next generation, and who has the authority to tell the story. The bones changed the scientific map, but the map of scientific power is still changing. Each discovery removed another support from the old picture. Taung showed that a small-brained upright hominin could exist. South African caves revealed multiple branches. Olduvai connected fossils with tools and ancient environments. Hadar and Letoli made bipedal life tangible. Chad widened the geography. Together, these remains did more than place human origins in Africa. They revealed that the path toward humanity had begun in bodies very different from ours, moving through landscapes that were about to change again and again. The landscapes beneath those fossils were never fixed backdrops. They changed around the hominins who inhabited them, sometimes slowly enough for generations to adjust, sometimes quickly enough to turn familiar ground into uncertainty. To understand why so many branches of the human family appeared in Africa, it is necessary to imagine the continent not as a single environment, but as a vast mosaic in motion. Forests advanced and retreated, grasslands opened and closed, lakes rose, split, and vanished. Rivers shifted course, volcanic highlands redirected rainfall, while deserts expanded into regions that had once supported wetlands and grazing animals. Ancient hominins did not evolve in one timeless savanna. They evolved within repeated cycles of fragmentation, connection, abundance, and loss. Millions of years before Homo sapiens, large parts of Africa were warmer and often more wooded than many of the regions seen today. Tropical forest covered broad areas, while woodland corridors extended beyond the modern limits of the equatorial zone. Yet even then, the continent contained considerable variety. Dense forest existed alongside open woodland, shrubland, river margins, and seasonal grassland. Early hominins lived within this ecological patchwork. Their teeth, limbs, and movement suggest that some could exploit resources on the ground while still climbing effectively. Upright walking did not necessarily begin because forests disappeared completely. More likely, it developed within mixed habitats where moving efficiently between scattered trees, feeding areas, and water sources offered advantages. The gradual cooling and drying that affected the world during the later Miocene and Pliocene altered this patchwork. Grasslands became more widespread in many regions, but the transition was neither uniform nor permanent. Pollen, plant waxes, fossil soils, animal remains, and lake sediments show repeated shifts between wetter and drier conditions. A location that supported woodland during one period might become open grassland in another, only to return later to a more wooded state. Hominins therefore encountered not a one-way march toward aridity, but a landscape that repeatedly reorganized itself. Eastern Africa became especially dynamic because of tectonic activity. As the East African Rift developed, sections of the crust stretched and fractured, mountains rose, basins sank, volcanoes erupted, and drainage systems changed. These geological processes created new habitats and barriers. Highlands intercepted moist air, leaving drier zones in their rain shadows. Deep basins collected water and formed lakes, sometimes vast, sometimes temporary. Volcanic ash spread across plains and later became one of the most useful tools for dating fossils, but at the time it could bury vegetation, alter water supplies, and transform local ecosystems. Lake systems were among the most unstable features. Sediment cores from eastern Africa preserve records of repeated episodes when lakes expanded dramatically and then contracted or disappeared. During wet phases, broad freshwater bodies supported fish, water birds, reeds, grazing animals, and rich shoreline resources. During dry phases, those same basins could fragment into smaller pools or turn into dusty flats. A population living near a lake might enjoy dependable food and water for generations, then face shrinking shorelines and increasing competition as rainfall weakened. Such environmental flickers may have influenced movement and contact between hominian groups. When water was abundant, populations could spread across regions that were otherwise difficult to cross. When conditions deteriorated, groups may have retreated toward rivers, springs, highlands, forests, or coastal zones. These refugees could isolate populations from one another. Over long periods, separation might encourage anatomical or behavioral differences. Later, climatic improvement could reconnect them, allowing renewed exchange or competition. No single explanation fully accounts for the branching patterns seen in the fossil record, but repeated isolation and reconnection provide a plausible background for why several hominin forms could emerge and sometimes coexist. The animals around them changed as well. Fossil assemblages record shifts among woodland browsers, open country grazers, and species adapted to mixed environments. Antelope communities became especially diverse, with different species specializing in grass, leaves, or more flexible diets. Elephants, pigs, horses, carnivores, monkeys, and many other animals responded to the same changing habitats. Hominins were part of this larger ecological experiment. They were not standing outside nature, steadily mastering it. They were one group among many, competing for food, avoiding predators, and adjusting to environments that could favor one strategy for a time and punish it later. Dietary flexibility may have become increasingly important. Fossil teeth preserve microscopic wear and chemical signals from the foods individuals consumed. These records do not always match anatomy in simple ways. A species with large chewing teeth may not have eaten hard foods every day. Such teeth may have served as protection during difficult seasons when preferred foods disappeared. Other hominins may have shifted between fruits, leaves, underground storage organs, seeds, insects, meat, and aquatic resources depending on local conditions. The ability to exploit several food sources could become valuable in a world where rainfall and vegetation were unreliable. Water shaped almost every aspect of this life. In dry periods, rivers and springs concentrated animals into smaller areas. These places offered opportunities but also danger. Predators gathered near water, and competition intensified. Moving between water sources required memory, timing, and risk assessment. A group that understood seasonal cycles, recognized distant landscape features, or maintained social knowledge of hidden springs possessed advantages that left no direct fossil trace. What survives in the record suggests that environmental unpredictability may have favored not merely stronger bodies, but better coordination and increasingly flexible behavior. The classic phrase savanna hypothesis once implied that the opening of grasslands drove the decisive changes in human evolution. Open country may indeed have mattered. Upright posture can improve energy efficiency during long-distance walking and may help with visibility or carrying. But early bipedalism appears before the full expansion of the vast grasslands once imagined, and several early hominins retained strong climbing adaptations. The evidence now points toward woodland mosaics, rather than a simple forest-to-savanna switch. Human evolution did not begin when apes stepped suddenly from trees onto an empty plain. It unfolded among overlapping habitats where ground travel and climbing could both remain useful. Central and Western Africa complicate the picture further. Tropical forests preserve fossils poorly because warm, acidic soils destroy bone. Dense vegetation also makes sites difficult to locate. As a result, these regions appear almost empty on many evolutionary maps. Yet the absence of fossils cannot be treated as proof that hominins were absent. Genetic patterns in living populations and rare archaeological finds suggest long and complex histories in areas where skeletal evidence has vanished. Recent evidence from Côte d'Ivoire, though far younger than the earliest hominins, demonstrates that Homo sapiens or closely related populations were using humid tropical forest environments around 150,000 years ago. This discovery weakens the old assumption that early humans were fundamentally creatures of open grasslands who entered dense forests only very late. Northern Africa underwent equally dramatic transformations. Today the Sahara appears to divide the continent, but over deep time it repeatedly shifted between desert and greener conditions. Stronger monsoons created grasslands, lakes, and river networks, linking northern Africa with regions farther south. During arid phases, those routes narrowed or disappeared. These cycles affected animal movement and later human dispersal. North Africa was not a permanent margin of the human story. It could function as a corridor, a refuge, or a zone of isolation depending on rainfall. Southern Africa offered another mosaic of coastlines, interior plains, mountains, caves, and zones influenced by shifting winter and summer rainfall. Coastal resources, plant diversity, and protected rock shelters later became especially important in the history of Homo sapiens. But even there, conditions fluctuated. Sea levels moved as global ice sheets expanded and contracted, repeatedly exposing and drowning broad coastal plains. Many places once used by ancient populations now lie beneath the ocean, which means the surviving archaeological record may represent only part of the environments they knew. Africa's importance then does not rest on one perfect habitat. It rests on the coexistence of many habitats and the repeated pressure to move between them. The continent offered forests and grasslands, deserts and wetlands, highlands and coasts, often within shifting reach of one another. A lineage specialized too narrowly might flourish during one interval and decline when conditions changed. Another capable of altering diet, movement, technology, or social behavior could persist through greater instability. That flexibility was never guaranteed. Many hominin branches disappeared despite surviving for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. Evolution did not consistently reward intelligence, cooperation, or adaptability in the forms later humans would recognize. Sometimes large teeth were successful, sometimes powerful jaws were successful, sometimes climbing ability remained valuable. The African fossil record is crowded with strategies that worked until they no longer did. Across this unstable continent, one anatomical experiment had already become deeply established. Long before the first stone tool industries and long before the genus Homo, several hominins were moving habitually on two legs. Their upright gait did not free them from the environment. It tied them to it in a new way, changing how they traveled, fed, carried, climbed, and encountered the shifting ground beneath them. Walking on two legs is so ordinary to modern humans that its strangeness is easy to miss. Every step depends on a body extensively reorganized from the pattern seen in other living apes. The spine curves to balance the torso above the hips. The pelvis is shortened and widened. The thigh bone angles inward so the knees fall beneath the center of gravity. The foot becomes a weight-bearing platform with arches, a strong heel, and a big toe aligned with the others rather than spread outward for grasping. Muscles that once served mainly in climbing take on new roles in stabilizing the body during each stride. None of these changes appeared at once. Bipedalism was assembled gradually, through combinations of traits that could differ from one early hominin to another. This is why the origin of upright walking remains one of the most important and difficult questions in human evolution. A fossil skull may suggest how the head sat upon the spine, but it cannot reveal the entire gait. A fragment of thigh bone may indicate weight transmission, yet say little about climbing. A pelvis can be decisive, but complete examples are rare. Footprints capture movement directly, though they rarely preserve the identity of whoever made them. Scientists must combine scattered evidence from different species, regions, and periods, knowing that no single specimen records the whole transition. The oldest possible clues come from Africa close to the time when the human lineage separated from the ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos, perhaps between 6 and 8 million years ago. Sahelanthropus from Chad, dated to roughly 7 million years ago, possesses an opening at the base of the skull that may indicate a more upright head position. More recently described limb bones attributed to the same species have been interpreted as consistent with some form of bipedal movement, though scholars still debate the strength of that conclusion. The fossils are limited, distorted, and difficult to assign with absolute confidence. Sahelanthropus may lie near the beginning of the hominin line, but the evidence remains incomplete. Ororhyntuganensis, known from fossils found in Kenya and dated to around 6 million years ago, offers another early possibility. Its thigh bone contains features suggesting that the hip joint carried body weight in a manner compatible with upright walking, yet the upper limbs retained adaptations useful for climbing. This combination is not contradictory. Early bipedalism may have developed in creatures that still spent considerable time in trees. The human lineage did not necessarily abandon climbing before beginning to walk upright. For millions of years, the two forms of movement may have existed together. Ardipithecus ramidus, from Ethiopia around 4.4 million years ago, makes that mosaic even clearer. Its pelvis contains traits associated with bipedal posture, while its foot retained a grasping big toe. The hands and wrists do not resemble those of modern knuckle-walking apes, suggesting that the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees may not have moved exactly like a chimpanzee. This is a lesser-known but important point. Humans did not evolve from modern chimpanzees, and the earliest hominins were not simply chimp-like animals slowly straightening their backs. Both lineages changed after separating from a shared ancestor whose anatomy remains uncertain. Ardipithecus also complicates the idea that bipedalism began on open savanna. Evidence from the surrounding sediments, plants, and animals indicates a wooded environment. The creature may have walked upright on the ground while climbing carefully through branches above. If so, upright posture was already emerging before broad open grasslands dominated many later East African landscapes. The reason it began cannot be reduced to one dramatic environmental shift. Several explanations have been proposed. Walking on two legs may have reduced the energy required to travel between scattered food patches. It may have made carrying food, tools, or gathered materials easier. Upright posture could have improved the ability to reach fruit, monitor surroundings, or regulate heat under direct sunlight. In woodland settings, it may have helped an animal feed while standing among low branches. Some hypotheses emphasize social behavior, suggesting that carrying food to others could have favored habitual bipedalism. Others focus on movement through shallow water or the ability to travel efficiently as habitats became more fragmented. Each idea may explain part of the pattern, but no single explanation fully accounts for the anatomical evidence. The difficulty lies partly in treating bipedalism as if it had only one function. Natural selection often modifies structures for several purposes at once. A pelvis that improves upright balance may also change climbing mechanics. Longer legs can make walking more efficient but reduce agility in trees. A foot capable of pushing powerfully from the ground loses some grasping ability. Evolution works through these compromises. Early hominins were not moving toward a perfect human gait. They were surviving with combinations that were useful enough in their own environments. By around 4 million years ago, habitual bipedalism becomes much clearer in African fossils. Australopithecus anamensis, known from Kenya and Ethiopia, possessed a lower leg adapted to bearing weight through an extended knee. Its ankle and shins suggest regular upright walking, while other features indicate that climbing remained important. Later, Australopithecines carried the experiment further, with lower bodies increasingly committed to terrestrial bipedalism, but upper limbs still capable of powerful climbing. The most direct evidence comes not from bone but from tracks left in volcanic ash. At Letoli in Tanzania, footprints dating to about 3.66 million years ago preserve the passage of upright hominins across a damp surface. Their makers placed the heel down first and transferred weight toward the front of the foot in a broadly human-like manner. The big toe appears aligned rather than strongly divergent. Yet the stride and pressure patterns may not have been identical to those of modern humans. The prints show established bipedal movement, but they do not reveal whether the walkers still climbed trees or how much time they spent above the ground. Another set of footprints at Laetoli, discovered decades ago and later re-examined, may have been made by a different kind of hominin moving through the same region. Their unusual cross-stepping pattern and shape have generated debate. Some researchers interpret them as evidence that more than one bipedal species occupied the landscape at roughly the same time. Others remain cautious about their identification. If the interpretation is correct, bipedalism was not one standardized gait inherited unchanged by all later humans. It may have been an evolutionary field of experiments, with different species walking upright in different ways. This possibility matches the wider fossil record. Feet from several early hominins show distinct combinations of arches, toe alignment, flexibility, and climbing capacity. Upright walking may have evolved once near the base of the hominin lineage and then been modified repeatedly, or similar forms of bipedalism may have developed through more complicated pathways. Scholars still debate the details. What is clear is that the earliest sustained evidence comes from Africa and extends across millions of years. Bipedalism altered more than locomotion. Standing and walking upright changed how the hands could be used. Though it did not automatically create toolmakers, hands were already capable of grasping long before hominins regularly made stone tools. Freeing them from constant weight-bearing may nevertheless have expanded the range of carrying, gathering, manipulating, and signaling behaviors. Upright travel also changed the relationship between the body and distance. A bipedal hominin could move across broken habitats differently from a quadrupedal ape, carrying resources between places and perhaps reducing the energetic cost of longer journeys. The new posture also imposed costs. The lower back bore greater strain. Knees and hips endured repeated loading. The reshaped pelvis would eventually interact with the demands of giving birth to increasingly large-brained infants, though that later problem had not yet reached its modern form. Falls from upright posture could be dangerous. Speed over short distances remained limited compared with many four-legged animals. Bipedalism was not an obvious improvement in every circumstance. It was a trade, exchanging some climbing and sprinting abilities for efficient terrestrial movement and new behavioral possibilities. By the time the Australopithecine spread across eastern and southern Africa, walking on two legs was no longer an uncertain novelty. It had become the foundation upon which later human anatomy would be built. Yet above those increasingly committed hips and legs sat brains still much closer in size to those of living apes than to our own. The body had changed its relationship with the ground long before the mind followed the trajectory once assumed by early researchers. That contradiction would become impossible to ignore in one of the most famous skeletons ever recovered. The contradiction took shape in a shallow gully at Hadar, Ethiopia, where fragments of bone began appearing from the exposed sediments in November 1974. The skeleton was incomplete, weathered, and scattered, yet enough survived to reveal one ancient individual in remarkable detail. Portions of the skull, ribs, spine, pelvis, arms, and legs belonged to a small adult Australopithecus afarensis who had lived about 3.2 million years ago. She would become known as Lucy, a name far more familiar than the scientific label attached to her species. Her fame sometimes makes her seem like a solitary ancestor standing at the beginning of humanity, but that image is misleading. Lucy was one member of a population, one branch within a wider evolutionary thicket, and one particularly vivid example of a body assembled from traits that no living animal possesses in quite the same combination. She stood a little over 1 meter tall. Her brain was small, probably around the lower end of the range seen in modern chimpanzees. Her face projected forward, her jaws were strong, and her arms were relatively long. The fingers were curved in a way that suggests regular climbing, while the shoulder and upper torso retained features useful for movement above the ground. Yet her pelvis and lower limbs were unmistakably adapted to upright walking. The thigh bone angled toward the knee. The hip joints carried the body's weight in a bipedal posture. The pelvis was short and broad compared with that of a quadrupedal ape, helping stabilize the torso while one foot left the ground during each step. This strange mixture is what makes Lucy important. She does not fit comfortably into the old image of evolution as a gradual transformation from an ape body into a human one, with every feature changing at the same speed. Her anatomy is mosaic. Different parts of the body follow different evolutionary schedules. Upright walking becomes well established while the brain remains small. Climbing adaptations persist even as the legs become increasingly suited to movement across the ground. The hand is not yet the hand of a later human toolmaker, but neither is it simply the hand of a modern ape. Evolution does not rebuild an organism according to one clean design. It modifies inherited structures piece by piece, preserving older functions where they remain useful and changing others when conditions favor a new balance. Lucy's species lived across parts of eastern Africa between roughly 3.9 and 3 million years ago. Fossils attributed to Australopithecus afarensis have been recovered from Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania, suggesting a broad geographical range. These populations inhabited mixed landscapes containing woodland, bush, river margins, and more open areas. They were not confined to one environmental type. Their survival over hundreds of thousands of years indicates that the combination of walking and climbing was not a temporary failure waiting to become more human. It was a successful adaptation in its own right. The upper body provides some of the clearest evidence that life in trees still mattered. Lucy's arms were long relative to her legs when compared with modern humans. Her shoulder joint faced more upward, and the structure of the shoulder blade may have supported overhead movement. Curved finger and toe bones could withstand the forces produced while gripping branches. These features suggest that Australopithecus afarensis climbed for food, safety, rest, or all three. Some researchers have proposed that individuals may have slept in trees, especially where large predators were common. Direct evidence for such behavior is absent, but the anatomy makes regular climbing difficult to dismiss. At the same time, Lucy was not merely an ape who could occasionally stand. Her lower body shows habitual bipedalism. The shape of the pelvis would have allowed muscles along the side of the hip to prevent the body from collapsing sideways during single-legged support. This stabilization is essential to ordinary human walking. The knee and ankle transmitted weight in an upright position, and other members of her species likely made the footprints preserved at Letoli. Their gait may have differed somewhat from ours because of shorter legs, different proportions, and lingering flexibility in the foot, but they moved through their landscapes on two legs as a regular part of life. The pelvis also reveals how dramatically locomotion had reshaped the body. In a quadrupedal ape, the blades of the pelvis are relatively long and oriented differently. In Lucy, they curve around the sides, creating the architecture needed to balance an upright torso. Yet her pelvis was not identical to that of a modern human. Early reconstructions sometimes exaggerated its width because parts had been distorted after burial. Later work corrected some of these errors and produced a more functional shape. This is a reminder that fossils do not arrive ready to explain themselves. Sediments compress them, bones fracture, missing pieces must be estimated. Even famous specimens remain open to revision as imaging, comparison, and reconstruction improve. Lucy's death has also attracted speculation. A study of fractures in her bones proposed that she may have died after falling from a considerable height, perhaps from a tree. Other researchers questioned whether the breaks occurred at the moment of death or later through geological pressure and fossilization. No single explanation fully accounts for all the damage. The debate is revealing because it reflects the central tension in her anatomy. If she regularly climbed, falling was a genuine risk. If the fractures are unrelated to such an event, her skeleton still shows that the trees remained part of her world. Australopithecus afarensis probably ate a varied diet. Teeth and chemical evidence indicate the consumption of plant foods from different environments, including fruits, leaves, seeds, grasses, sedges, and possibly underground storage organs. Meat or insects may occasionally have supplemented the diet, though the extent is uncertain. Their relatively thick tooth enamel and robust jaws allowed them to process foods that could be tough or abrasive. They may have shifted what they ate as seasons changed, relying on less desirable fallback foods when fruit and softer resources became scarce. Their social lives are harder to reconstruct. Differences in body size between males and females have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of strong competition among males, perhaps resembling the social patterns of certain living primates. Other estimates suggest that the size difference may have been less extreme than once thought. Fossils provide no direct record of pair bonds, group structure, caregiving, or communication. Comparisons with chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates can generate possibilities, but none serves as a perfect model. Australopithecus afarensis belonged to an extinct lineage with its own social arrangements. A remarkable concentration of at least 13 individuals from the Adar region, sometimes called the first family, shows that several members of the species died within the same geological setting. They may have belonged to one group and been killed by a sudden event such as flooding, though the circumstances remain disputed. The discovery does not prove a particular social organization, but it reinforces the fact that Lucy was not an isolated evolutionary experiment. Populations of small, upright, partly tree-adapted hominins were living and moving together through East Africa for an immense span of time. The hands of Australopithecus afarensis add another layer to the mosaic. Their proportions suggest better precision handling than in some living apes, though they lacked the full suite of features associated with later human manipulation. Stone tools securely connected to the species have not been established. Cut-marked animal bones from Dakika, Ethiopia, dated to roughly 3.4 million years ago, have been interpreted as possible evidence that Australopithecines used sharp stones to remove flesh or break into carcasses. The marks remain controversial. Some specialists argue that trampling or other natural processes could have produced similar damage. What survives in the record suggests at least the possibility that tool-assisted behavior began before the genus Homo, but the evidence is not yet decisive. Lucy therefore stands at the center of several overturned assumptions. Walking upright did not require a large brain. A hominin could be an efficient biped without abandoning the trees. Human-like traits did not appear together as a coordinated package. Technology may not belong exclusively to later Homo, and anatomy alone cannot reveal the full complexity of behavior. Her body is less a missing link than a warning against the idea of missing links altogether. Evolution is not a chain with one form connecting neatly to the next. It is a branching process in which successful combinations persist, diversify, and sometimes disappear. Australopithecus afarensis eventually vanished, but not before populations like Lucy's had occupied eastern Africa for nearly 1 million years. Whether the species gave rise directly to later Australopithecines or early Homo remains uncertain. It may stand near the ancestry of several later branches, or it may represent one close relative among others still poorly known. The fossil record around 3 million years ago becomes increasingly crowded, and the clarity offered by one famous skeleton gives way to a far more complicated picture. Several kinds of hominins begin to appear across Africa, each carrying a different arrangement of teeth, jaws, limbs, brains, and behaviours. Lucy's mosaic body was not the end of an experiment. It was part of a continent-wide multiplication of experiments, most of which would leave no living descendants. The multiplication becomes especially visible between about 3 and 2 million years ago, when Africa begins to preserve not one obvious ancestral form, but several hominin populations living across overlapping regions and adapting in different ways. Some possessed massive jaws and enormous teeth. Others had lighter faces, smaller chewing structures, and hands increasingly capable of precise manipulation. Some retained strong climbing abilities. Others show bodies more committed to life on the ground. Their fossils do not line up like figures in a procession. They appear beside one another, separated by uncertain gaps, often known from only a few bones, and frequently assigned names that later discoveries force scientists to reconsider. This is why the image of a ladder has become one of the most misleading pictures in human evolution. A ladder suggests that one species improves into another, each replacing the form below it until modern humans appear at the top. The African fossil record looks more like a dense and uneven bush. Branches divide. Some continue for long periods. Some overlap with close relatives. Others disappear quickly or remain invisible because their bones were never preserved. A species can possess one trait that seems advanced and another that appears ancient. Several lineages can experiment with similar adaptations at the same time, without any of them being direct ancestors of Homo sapiens. The robust Australopithecines offer one of the clearest examples. Commonly placed in the genus Paranthropus, they lived in eastern and southern Africa for well over 1 million years. Their skulls were built around chewing. Broad faces provided space for large muscles. Some possessed a ridge along the top of the skull where powerful jaw muscles attached. Their premolars and molars were enormous, coated in thick enamel and supported by heavy jaws. To earlier researchers, such anatomy sometimes looked crude or unsuccessful, a biological dead end standing beside the supposedly more progressive genus Homo. Yet Paranthropus was not a brief mistake. Different species survived across changing environments, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years. Their teeth suggest diets more complex than their appearance implies. East African forms such as Paranthropus bossei consumed large amounts of grasses, sedges, or foods carrying similar chemical signatures, while southern populations may have relied on a broader mixture of resources. Their massive chewing equipment may have allowed them to process difficult fallback foods during lean seasons rather than hard objects every day. Whatever the exact diet, the strategy worked for a very long time. At the same time, less robust Australopithecines occupied parts of the continent. Australopithecus africanus persisted in southern Africa after the period of Lucy's species, Australopithecus gari in Ethiopia, Australopithecus sediba in South Africa, and other proposed species add further complexity, though their relationships remain disputed. Some may lie near the ancestry of Homo. Others may be side branches preserving combinations that evolved independently. Fossil samples are often too small to provide certainty, and the difference between a new species and normal variation within an old one can be difficult to establish from a handful of teeth or a partial jaw. Even the boundary between Australopithecus and Homo is less secure than the name suggests. Textbooks once implied that Homo appeared as a clearly recognizable package: larger brain, smaller teeth, human-like hands, stone tools, and a more modern body. The earliest candidates do not cooperate with that expectation. They retain many Australopithecine features while showing only modest shifts toward later human anatomy. Brain size overlaps. Body proportions remain poorly known. Teeth vary. The first members of Homo were not suddenly modern. They were another set of mosaic hominins emerging within an already crowded landscape. Recent discoveries at Geraru in Ethiopia sharpen this picture. Fossils from the Afar region indicate that early Homo and an Australopithecine population lived there more than 2.5 million years ago. The remains are fragmentary, including jaws and teeth, but their coexistence matters. One lineage did not wait politely for the other to disappear. Different hominins occupied the same broad region during the same interval, perhaps using different foods, habitats, or social strategies. The evidence does not reveal whether they encountered one another directly, but their worlds overlapped. The oldest widely accepted stone tools make the timing even more complicated. At Lomekwi in Kenya, large stone artifacts date to about 3.3 million years ago, long before the earliest secure fossils assigned to Homo. Their makers struck heavy stones to remove flakes, though the technique differs from later Oldowan toolmaking. No hominin bones were found in direct association, so the identity of the toolmakers is unknown. They may have been Kenyanthropus, an Australopithecine, or another population not yet discovered. The tools demonstrate that the capacity to fracture stone deliberately cannot be treated as the exclusive invention of Homo. Farther east, the Oldowan tradition appears by at least about 2.6 million years ago, and possibly earlier. These tools include flakes, cores, and battered stones produced through repeated strikes. They are technologically simple compared with later hand axes, yet making them requires control, attention to stone properties, and the ability to recognize useful edges within fractured rock. Oldowan tools occur at sites associated with early Homo, but also in landscapes inhabited by Paranthropus. It remains difficult to assign every tool assemblage to one species. Several hominins may have used stone, or tools may have moved through environments where multiple species left remains. This uncertainty matters because behavior does not fossilize as neatly as teeth. A sharp flake can cut meat, slice plants, shape wood, or process hides, but the same artifact rarely reveals which task occurred. Bone marks may indicate butchery, while wear on tools can suggest contact with particular materials. Even then, interpretations remain probabilistic. What survives in the record suggests that technological behavior was spreading among African hominins during a period of increasing ecological and anatomical diversity, but no single discovery identifies a moment when intelligence suddenly crossed a threshold. Variation also existed within species. Fossils from different regions may look distinct because populations were separated by geography, diet, or time. A jaw from Ethiopia and one from South Africa need not represent different species simply because they differ. Conversely, bones that appear similar may conceal genetically separate lineages. Paleontologists must make species judgments without access to DNA for most fossils older than a few 100,000 years, especially in warm African climates where genetic material degrades quickly. The names on the family tree are therefore working hypotheses, not permanent labels carved into nature. Some branches are known from astonishingly little. A few teeth can suggest diet and evolutionary relationships, yet teeth alone cannot reveal posture, body size, or brain anatomy. A fragmentary skull may reshape the tree. only for a later discovery to move it again. Entire populations could have lived in humid forests where their bones dissolved before fossilization. Others may lie beneath modern cities, deserts, lakes, or unexplored sediments. The apparent density of species in eastern and southern Africa partly reflects where geology exposes fossils and where researchers have searched most intensively. The family tree is also crowded because evolution does not erase older forms as soon as new ones appear. Paranthropus survived after early Homo had emerged. Australopithecine populations persisted alongside toolmaking hominins. Later, several species of Homo would share Africa and Eurasia at the same time. The existence of one branch does not prove that another was inferior or already doomed. Extinction can result from climate, competition, small population size, disease, chance, or combinations that leave little evidence. A successful lineage can vanish after 1,000,000 years, while a newly evolved one survives through circumstances no fossil can fully record. This branching world changes the question scientists ask. Instead of searching for the single creature that became human, they examine populations, exchanges, and combinations of traits. Which lineages contributed ancestry to later Homo, which adaptations arose more than once? Which species shared landscapes or resources? How often did populations separate and reconnect? No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, but the growing evidence makes one conclusion unavoidable. Africa was not producing a sequence of increasingly human forms. It was sustaining a broad evolutionary experiment in which many kinds of hominins tested different ways of living. Most of those experiments ended. Paranthropus disappeared. Australopithecines vanished. Several early forms of Homo left no clear descendants. Yet among these overlapping populations, one lineage began to combine more efficient travel, flexible hands, changing teeth, expanding brains, and increasingly dependent relationships with tools. Its appearance would not simplify the family tree. It would create another set of branches, some of which would eventually move far beyond Africa, while others remained rooted within it. Stone does not preserve intention, yet sometimes a broken rock carries the outline of a decision made more than 3,000,000 years ago. A hominin selected a piece of suitable material, placed it against another stone, and struck with enough force and control to detach a sharp fragment. The result was not elegant. It did not resemble the symmetrical hand axes of later periods, or the finely shaped blades of much more recent humans. But the action altered the relationship between body and environment. Teeth, nails, and muscle were no longer the only means of opening, cutting, scraping, or crushing. A temporary edge could be created when needed, carried elsewhere, used, discarded, and perhaps remembered. The oldest widely discussed evidence of deliberate stone technology comes from Lamekwi 3 near Lake Turkana in Kenya, where artifacts have been dated to about 3.3 million years ago. They are far older than the earliest secure fossils assigned to the genus Homo. Some are unusually large and heavy, including battered cores, anvils, and flakes produced by forceful strikes. The makers seem to have used several methods, sometimes holding one stone and striking it against another, sometimes placing a core on a hard surface and hammering it from above. Their technique was less standardized than later older one toolmaking, but it was not random geological breakage. The pattern of impacts and removed flakes suggests purposeful manipulation. Who made these tools remains unknown. Kenyanthropus platyops lived in the wider region during roughly the same broad period, while Australopithecines were also present in East Africa. No hominin skeleton lies beside the Lomekwi artifacts with a clear claim of ownership. The tools therefore break a once comfortable link between technology and Homo. Stoneworking may have emerged among small-brained hominins whose bodies still retained strong climbing adaptations. Intelligence capable of recognizing fracture patterns did not require a brain approaching modern human size. And the first steps toward technology may have begun within species that left no direct descendants. Earlier still, possible signs of stone-assisted behavior appear on animal bones from Dakika in Ethiopia, dated to about 3.4 million years ago. Several marks have been interpreted as cuts and percussion damage made when a hominin used sharp stones to remove flesh or break bone. Critics argue that trampling, sediment pressure, or other natural processes could produce similar marks. The evidence remains disputed. Even if the marks were made by tools, no shaped artifacts were found with them. A naturally sharp stone may have been picked up and used without further modification, a behaviour almost impossible to detect unless the edge happened to touch bone. This raises a distinction that the archaeological record can rarely resolve. Tool use is not the same as tool manufacture. Chimpanzees, capuchin monkeys, sea otters, and other animals use stones, sticks, leaves, or shells to solve immediate problems. Some select materials carefully and transport them over short distances. The common ancestor shared by humans and other apes may therefore have possessed basic object-using abilities. What becomes increasingly visible in the African record is not the sudden invention of tools from nothing, but the growing regularity with which hominins modified stone to produce predictable results. By around 2.6 million years ago, this regularity becomes clearer in the Oldowan tradition. Sites in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania preserve cores from which flakes were deliberately removed, along with the flakes themselves and battered stones used for pounding. The name comes from Olduvai Gorge, though older examples have since been found elsewhere. An Oldowan artifact can look deceptively crude. A core may resemble an ordinary cobble missing a few pieces, yet the useful product was often the detached flake, whose edge could be sharp enough to slice skin and flesh with little effort. Producing such a flake requires several linked judgments. The maker must select a stone with suitable fracture properties, fine-grained lava, quartz, quartzite, chert, and other materials behave differently when struck. The angle of impact matters, as does the shape of the striking surface. A poorly aimed blow can crush the edge or fail to detach anything useful. Even a simple sequence demands coordination between eye, hand, grip, and force. Experimental knapping shows that beginners often struggle to produce consistent flakes, while experienced makers read the stone almost as a set of possibilities hidden beneath its surface. The earliest toolmakers were unlikely to have planned long, complex sequences in the manner of later artisans, but they were doing more than smashing rocks. At some sites, stone was carried away from its geological source, sometimes over distances of several kilometers. This means a hominin recognized useful material before the immediate need arose, or returned repeatedly to locations where such stone could be found. The landscape was acquiring a technological geography. Certain outcrops, riverbeds, carcass sites, and food processing places may have been linked in memory. The uses of Oldowan tools were probably varied. Cut marks on animal bones show that sharp flakes removed flesh and sometimes reached joints. Percussion scars indicate that heavy stones broke long bones, providing access to marrow. Whether hominins hunted large animals regularly or often scavenged remains left by carnivores remains debated. At some sites, the sequence of marks suggests early access to carcasses. At others, hominins may have arrived after predators. A flexible strategy is more plausible than one universal pattern. Small animals could be captured directly, while larger carcasses might be scavenged, contested, or occasionally hunted under favourable conditions. Stone tools also processed materials that preserve poorly. Sharp edges can cut grasses, roots, bark, and woody stems. Hammerstones can crack nuts, crush seeds, or break underground storage organs. Where patterns and residues from later sites demonstrate this broad range of uses, and similar activities may have occurred much earlier. The archaeological record is biased toward meat because butchered bone survives more readily than sliced plants. An apparent revolution in carnivory may partly reflect the survival of bones rather than the full diet of the toolmakers. Access to marrow and animal tissue nevertheless mattered. These foods offered concentrated energy and nutrients, especially valuable to hominins living amid seasonal uncertainty. But tools did not simply add meat to the menu, they allowed food to be transformed outside the mouth. Cutting reduced the work required from teeth and jaws. Pounding made hard or fibrous resources easier to consume. Over long periods, processing food with tools may have contributed to anatomical changes, though it is difficult to separate technological effects from cooking, climate, diet, and other pressures that came later. Toolmaking also created new risks and dependencies. A sharp edge is useful only if stone can be found and the method remembered. Carrying a tool or core occupies the hands. Knapping can produce cuts, and the sound of breaking stone may attract attention. Processing a carcass takes time in places where carnivores may return. Technology did not remove hominins from danger. It allowed them to enter new situations in which knowledge, timing, and cooperation became increasingly important. Social learning may have been one of the most consequential changes. A hominin could discover through accident that a blow created a sharp flake. But a tradition lasting across many generations requires repeated transmission. Young individuals could watch others choose stones and strike them. Group members might tolerate close observation, share access to materials, or leave behind cores that others reused. Direct teaching cannot be demonstrated at these early dates, and language in any modern sense is unlikely. Yet Oldowan technology shows enough continuity to suggest that behaviour was copied and retained socially. The surprising feature is how long the basic Oldowan pattern endured. For hundreds of thousands of years, hominins continued producing flakes and cores that changed only gradually. This does not mean their minds were static. A versatile technology may not need constant redesign. The same sharp flake could serve many tasks, and mobile groups may have favoured quick, low-investment tools that could be made and abandoned almost anywhere suitable. Stone occurred. Innovation is not always visible as increasing complexity. Different hominin species may also have participated in the same technological world. Early Homo is frequently associated with Oldowan sites, but Paranthropus fossils occur in some of the same landscapes. Hands attributed to Australopithecines show combinations compatible with forceful and precise grips. No exclusive toolmaker can be identified for every assemblage. The evidence remains incomplete, and the habit of assigning all technology to Homo may say as much about modern expectations as about ancient behaviour. What stone tools reveal most clearly is a widening gap between anatomy and survival. A tooth is fixed during development. A hand has inherited limits. A stone edge can be created, replaced, and altered within minutes. It allows behaviour to change faster than the body. Once knowledge becomes part of adaptation, populations can respond to environments through learned practices as well as biological evolution. This shift did not suddenly make its makers human. Their brains remained small by later standards, Their bodies retained ancient traits, and their technologies were limited, yet a new inheritance had begun to accumulate outside the skeleton. Stones on the ground became extensions of memory and action. Across Africa, hominins were no longer adapting only through the slow reshaping of bone. They were beginning to reshape the world around them, and in doing so, they were creating the conditions in which the earliest members of Homo would emerge. The earliest members of Homo do not arrive in the fossil record with the clarity their name implies. There is no single skeleton in which the Australopithecine body disappears and a recognizably human form suddenly takes its place. Instead, around the period between roughly 3 and 2 million years ago, Africa preserves a scattered collection of jaws, teeth, skull fragments, hands, and limb bones that reveal change without offering a clean boundary. Some specimens have slightly larger brains. Some possess smaller molars or less projecting faces. Some show hands increasingly suited to controlled manipulation. Others retain proportions and climbing adaptations inherited from much earlier hominins. The genus Homo begins not as a revolution, but as an argument. That argument continues because a genus is a human system for organizing nature, while evolution produces populations that change gradually and unevenly. Scientists generally use Homo for species considered more closely related to modern humans than to Australopithecines such as Lucy. But deciding where that division belongs is difficult. Brain size alone cannot settle it. Toolmaking cannot settle it, because stone technology predates the oldest secure Homo fossils. Body proportions remain unknown for many specimens. Even teeth and jaws overlap across proposed boundaries. One of the earliest fossils widely discussed as Homo comes from Ledidjararu in Ethiopia. The partial lower jaw, dated to about 2.8 million years ago, combines an Australopithecine-like chin region with teeth that show changes associated with later Homo. Its age places it near a period of environmental transition in eastern Africa, when habitats were becoming more open and variable in some regions. The jaw does not identify a complete species or reveal the appearance of its owner. It demonstrates that hominins with a new arrangement of traits were present earlier than many researchers once expected. Other fossils from the same broad interval complicate the picture. Teeth and jaws from Ledidjararu indicate that early Homo lived alongside an Australopithecine population more than 2.5 million years ago. Farther south and east, additional specimens have been placed near the base of Homo, though their classifications remain contested. Some may represent distinct populations. Others may belong to late Australopithecines. The evidence remains incomplete because the fossils most useful for defining anatomy are often missing. A tooth can survive where an entire skeleton disappears, but it cannot reveal the gait, proportions, or behavior of the individual who carried it. By about 2.4 to 1.9 million years ago, fossils traditionally assigned to Homo habilis appear in eastern and southern Africa. The name means handy human, reflecting the early belief that this species made the older one tools found at sites such as Olduvai Gorge. That association is no longer exclusive. Tools existed before Homo habilis, and several hominin species may have used them. Even so, fossils placed within Homo habilis show an intriguing mixture. Their brains were generally larger than those of Australopithecines, though still only about half the average size of a modern human brain. Their faces remained projecting, their bodies were small, and their arms could be relatively long. Some hand bones suggest strong grips and precise manipulation, while feet and legs indicate habitual bipedalism. The species itself may contain more variation than one biological population should. Some researchers divide certain fossils into Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, with the latter represented by a larger, flatter face and perhaps a larger brain. Others question whether the distinctions are sufficient or whether some specimens have been placed together incorrectly. The famous skull known as KNM-ER 1470 from Kenya has played a central role in this debate. Its reconstructed face differs from classic Homo habilis, yet distortion and incomplete preservation complicate comparisons. Scholars still debate whether early Homo consisted of one highly variable species or several neighbouring branches. Brain expansion is among the most visible trends, but it did not proceed smoothly. Australopithecine brains were generally in the range of about 400 to 550 cubic centimetres. Early Homo specimens often fall between roughly 500 and 750 with considerable overlap. A larger brain requires substantial energy, yet size alone does not reveal cognitive ability. Internal organization, neural connectivity, development, and social learning matter as well, none of which fossilize directly. Casts of the inner skull can preserve the general shape of the brain surface, but interpretations of language-related or planning-related regions remain cautious. The first Homo brains were changing, though they were not miniature versions of modern human brains. Teeth and faces were changing too. Compared with many Australopithecines, early Homo often possessed somewhat smaller molars, thinner jaws, and reduced chewing architecture. These shifts may reflect broader diets, greater reliance on processed food, increased access to animal tissue, or combinations of these factors. Stone flakes allowed food to be cut before chewing. Hammerstones could crush roots, seeds, and bones. Later, cooking would transform the relationship between diet and anatomy even further, but secure evidence for habitual fire use belongs to a much later and disputed record. Early Homo still needed powerful teeth. The change was relative, not absolute. Hands reveal another transition. The human hand combines a long, strong thumb with shorter, straighter fingers capable of both powerful and precise grips. Early Homo hand fossils show parts of this pattern, but not all of it. Some retained curved finger bones, suggesting that climbing or inherited anatomy still influenced the upper limbs. Others possessed thumb and wrist features suited to forceful pinching and controlled tool use. These were not hands designed for only one task. They could grip branches, carry food, hold infants protectively, strike stone, and manipulate objects with increasing control. Bodies also began to change in ways connected to movement. Homo habilis retained relatively short legs and long arms in some reconstructions, indicating a locomotor pattern not far removed from Australopithecines. Yet later early Homo populations developed longer legs, larger bodies, and more efficient long-distance walking. This transition would become especially pronounced in Homo erectus. The fossil record does not show exactly when these proportions emerged or whether different Homo populations reached them independently. What survives suggests a period of experimentation in which some lineages remained small-bodied and partly climbing adapted, while others became increasingly terrestrial. These anatomical changes unfolded alongside greater behavioral flexibility. Early Homo occupied environments ranging from lake margins and river systems to woodland mosaics and open grasslands. Tools allowed individuals to process foods that teeth alone handled less efficiently. Carrying stone, meat, plant foods, or water linked distant parts of the landscape. Repeated use of certain locations may have created activity areas where carcasses were processed or tools made, though these should not be imagined as permanent camps in the later human sense. The evidence rarely reveals how long groups stayed or whether artifacts accumulated through one event or many visits. Social dependence may have intensified as brains enlarged and development slowed. Larger-brained infants require extended care, but the timing of major changes in childhood growth remains uncertain. Fossil teeth preserve growth lines that can estimate developmental rates, and early Homo appears to have matured faster than modern humans. Even so, acquiring toolmaking skills, locating seasonal resources, and navigating predator-rich environments would have rewarded observation and tolerance within groups. Survival increasingly depended on knowledge carried by others. This did not make early Homo dominant. Large carnivores shared the same landscapes, and hominins were still vulnerable prey. Cut-marked bones show access to meat, while tooth marks on hominin fossils remind scientists that the relationship could reverse. Competition with hyenas, big cats, and other scavengers would have made carcass processing dangerous. A stone tool was useful, but it was not a shield against every threat. Cooperation, timing, and awareness probably mattered as much as the edge itself. The appearance of Homo may therefore reflect not one decisive anatomical innovation, but a new balance among several traits. Slightly larger brains supported more flexible learning. Smaller teeth became possible as tools processed food outside the mouth. More capable hands expanded the range of actions. Increasingly terrestrial bodies allowed wider movement. Social knowledge linked these advantages across generations. Each change influenced the others, yet no single explanation fully accounts for their emergence. Climate likely shaped the opportunities without dictating the outcome. Around the time early Homo appeared, Eastern Africa experienced repeated environmental shifts and increasing habitat variability. Populations able to move, alter diet, and rely on learned technology may have been better positioned to survive change. But Paranthropus also survived successfully with a very different anatomical strategy, and some Australopithecine branches persisted alongside Homo. Flexibility was one viable path, not the inevitable winner from the beginning. The oldest Homo fossils remain African because the lineage formed within the continent's already complex network of hominin populations. Yet once bodies became better suited to long-distance travel and technology, became a more dependable part of survival. The scale of movement expanded. Some descendants would remain within Africa, dividing and mixing over immense spans of time. Others would cross into lands no earlier hominin is known to have reached. Before those journeys became possible, however, early Homo first had to survive a continent whose lakes, forests, rivers, and grasslands repeatedly changed around them. Survival in Africa increasingly depended on more than the enduring one difficult environment. It required moving between environments that could change faster than anatomy could follow. A lake basin might support fish, reeds, grazing animals, and dense human activity for generations, then shrink into scattered pools. A woodland corridor might connect distant populations during a wet phase, only to break apart when rainfall weakened. Grasslands could widen, deserts advance, and river systems lose their flow. Across these shifts, early humans carried bodies shaped by the past into landscapes that no longer behaved as they once had. The African climate has never changed as one simple continental unit. Northern monsoons, tropical rain belts, Indian Ocean conditions, Atlantic currents, highland topography, and global ice cycles affected different regions in different ways. One area could become wetter, while another dried. East African lakes sometimes expanded dramatically during intervals of strong rainfall, while nearby habitats remained fragmented by elevation and local rain shadows. Southern Africa followed its own patterns, shaped partly by ocean systems and the shifting balance between winter and summer rainfall. The result was not one repeating rhythm but many overlapping rhythms. This complexity matters because older explanations often imagine climate change as a single force, pushing human evolution forward. A dry phase supposedly opened the savanna. A wet phase supposedly allowed migration. A crisis supposedly produced intelligence. Real environments were less orderly. The same climatic event could create opportunity in one region and disaster in another. Some populations might expand while others became isolated. Innovation could arise during abundance as easily as during hardship. Scholars still debate how closely major anatomical and behavioral changes can be tied to particular climate episodes, and the temptation to match every evolutionary development with an environmental crisis often exceeds the evidence. What survives in the record does show that later members of Homo became increasingly capable of occupying varied habitats. Homo erectus and closely related African populations appear by around 2 million years ago, with bodies more suited to long-distance travel than those of earlier Homo. Longer legs increased stride length and improved walking efficiency. Narrower waists and altered shoulders allowed the upper body to rotate differently during movement. Larger body size helped individuals cover ground and may have supported greater endurance. These changes did not produce one perfectly modern body, but they reduced some of the locomotor limitations inherited from Australopithecine ancestors. The famous Turkana boy skeleton from Kenya, dated to roughly 1.5 to 1.6 million years ago, reveals much of this transformation. The individual was not fully grown, yet already possessed tall stature, long legs, and a body largely committed to terrestrial life. His proportions were far closer to those of later humans than to Lucy's. The skeleton also preserves signs of growth and development that differed from modern patterns. He likely matured more quickly than people do today, reminding us that a human-like body did not necessarily carry a fully modern life history. Longer distance movement opened new possibilities. Groups would follow migrating animals, reach distant water sources, revisit seasonal plant resources, and transport stone over wider areas. Mobility could reduce dependence on any one local habitat, but it also required greater knowledge. A route that worked during one season might fail in another. Springs could dry, herds could change direction, safe crossings could become impassable. Information about landscapes therefore became part of survival, preserved through repeated travel and social memory. Technology also changed. Around 1.7 million years ago, Acheulean tools begin appearing in Africa. These include hand axes, cleavers, and other large cutting implements shaped more extensively than older one flakes. Their makers remove flakes from both sides of a stone, often creating a broadly symmetrical form. The final tool could cut meat, work wood, process plants, or serve as a source from which additional flakes were struck. Acheulean technology did not replace simpler tools immediately, and many sites contain mixed approaches. Its importance lies in the increased planning and control required to produce a shape that existed first as a mental or learned template. The hand axe became one of the longest-lasting technologies in human history. Similar forms were made across Africa and much of Eurasia for more than 1 million years. This durability is sometimes mistaken for cultural stagnation. Yet a reliable tool can remain useful precisely because it works across many environments. A hand axe could be carried, resharpened, and used for several tasks. Its persistence may reflect technological flexibility rather than an inability to innovate. Fire may have offered another advantage, though its early history is difficult to establish. Burned sediments, altered stone, and heated bones occur at several African sites. but natural wildfires can produce similar traces. Evidence for controlled or repeated fire use becomes more convincing later. While claims extending beyond 1,000,000 years remain debated, if early humans could maintain fire even occasionally, it would have transformed food, warmth, predator defense, and social time after darkness. Cooking softens food and increases access to energy, but no single archaeological horizon marks the moment when it became habitual. The evidence remains incomplete, and fire likely entered human life gradually rather than through one discovery. Dietary flexibility was more clearly visible. Early and middle Pleistocene humans consumed animal tissue, plant foods, seeds, tubers, fruits, and perhaps aquatic resources depending on place and season. Stone tools expanded what could be processed, while larger ranging areas increased access to scattered foods. Some groups may have hunted cooperatively. Though scavenging continued to matter, the balance likely changed repeatedly. Human survival did not depend on becoming exclusively carnivorous or mastering one ideal diet. It depended on using whatever combinations local environments made available. This flexibility reached habitats once considered unlikely settings for early humans. Forest margins, uplands, arid interiors, lake shores, coasts, and river valleys all entered the human niche at different times. Much later, Homo sapiens populations would occupy wet tropical forests in West Africa by at least around 150,000 years ago. That discovery challenges the long-standing assumption that dense rainforest was a late barrier, crossed only after humans became behaviorally modern. Forests conceal archaeology poorly in some ways and destroy it efficiently in others. Their apparent absence from earlier maps may reflect preservation and research gaps as much as real avoidance. Highlands also played a larger role than once believed. Elevated regions offered cooler temperatures, different plants and animals, and sometimes reliable water during lowland droughts. They also imposed lower oxygen levels and greater energetic costs. Evidence from several parts of Africa indicates that humans entered high-altitude settings earlier than older models predicted. Permanent biological adaptation to altitude would develop much later and differently in various populations, but behavioral flexibility allowed people to use uplands before genetic specialization became necessary. Coasts created another shifting world. During glacial periods, falling sea levels exposed vast plains now submerged. Rivers extended farther across the continental shelf, and productive shorelines moved tens of kilometers from their present locations. Archaeologists studying coastal adaptation therefore work with a damaged archive. Many camps, tool scatters, and food processing areas may now lie beneath the sea. Surviving caves along modern coasts preserve only the inland edge of much broader lost landscapes. Social cooperation tied these adaptations together. A larger range is useful only if knowledge moves with the group. Food sharing could reduce the risk of individual failure. Care for injured or weakened adults may have preserved experience that benefited others. Coordinated defense, toolmaking, and resource transport rewarded tolerance and communication. Direct evidence for specific social systems remained scarce. But later, Homo increasingly survived through collective behavior rather than individual anatomy alone. Language in the modern sense cannot be demonstrated for these early populations. The vocal tract does not fossilize completely, and brain shape reveals only limited clues. Yet communication must have become more effective as tool traditions, travel routes, and cooperative activities grew more complex. Gesture, calls, facial expression, and learned vocal signals may have formed an increasingly rich system long before fully developed language. The transition was probably gradual, With no clear dividing line between animal communication and human speech, population size remained a vulnerability. Mobile groups were likely small, and regional populations could shrink sharply during climatic downturns. A drought, disease outbreak, or broken migration corridor might erase a local tradition. Technologies could disappear when the people who knew them vanished. Later populations might reoccupy the same region with different tools and habits. Archaeological sequences therefore contain gaps and reversals rather than steady accumulation. These cycles of loss are as important as innovation. Humans adapted not because every discovery was preserved forever, but because populations repeatedly rebuilt knowledge under changing conditions. Some strategies spread, others remained local. Some disappeared and were reinvented. Flexibility itself was fragile, dependent on enough people surviving to pass skills onward. Africa functioned as a laboratory of life not because it constantly punished its inhabitants, but because it presented many combinations of stability and disruption. Refuges preserved populations during difficult periods. Wet corridors reconnected regions. Diverse habitats allowed different lifeways to coexist. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these conditions favored humans capable of changing behavior faster than their bones could change. By the time certain populations began moving beyond Africa, they carried more than long legs and stone tools. They carried traditions for reading landscapes, adjusting diets, sharing risk, and surviving ecological uncertainty. Those abilities have been tested repeatedly within the continent. Yet the first journeys outward were not triumphant marches toward global dominance. Many ended in isolation or disappearance, leaving only scattered fossils and tools beyond the African horizon. Beyond Africa, the record begins with fragments scattered across enormous distances, a jaw from one region, a skull from another, stone tools resting in sediments whose makers are unknown. These traces show that members of the human lineage crossed out of the continent long before Homo sapiens existed, but they do not describe one migration. They record repeated expansions, pauses, failures, and disappearances. Africa was not emptied by a single departure, nor did evolution shift permanently into Eurasia once the first hominins crossed the boundary. The continent remained the deepest reservoir of human diversity, while different branches moved outward and established temporary or lasting populations elsewhere. The earliest widely accepted evidence comes from Dmanisi in the modern nation of Georgia, where fossils dating to about 1.8 million years ago preserve several individuals with surprisingly small brains and varied skull shapes. Their bodies were adapted to upright travel, but they did not possess the large brains once assumed necessary for continental expansion. The stone tools associated with them were relatively simple, closer to Oldowan traditions than to the more elaborate Acheulean hand axes appearing in parts of Africa. This was a crucial revelation. The first hominins known to leave Africa did not need advanced technology or modern anatomy. They needed enough mobility, dietary flexibility, and social knowledge to follow habitable corridors into new landscapes. Dmanisi also reveals the danger of building too many species from too few fossils. The skulls differ noticeably in size and shape, yet they come from one location and a narrow interval of time. Some researchers interpret the variation as evidence that early Homo species such as Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and early Homo erectus may represent fewer distinct forms than often proposed. Others argue that the differences among African fossils remain too great to combine so easily. Scholars still debate how many early Homo lineages existed, but the Dmanisi population demonstrates how much variation can occur within one group. The route from Africa into Eurasia was neither a simple doorway nor a permanently open road. The northeastern edge of the continent connected with the Levant through Sinai, while changing sea levels and coastal conditions may have altered other possible paths near the Red Sea. Rainfall determined whether deserts became broad barriers or landscapes crossed by grasslands, rivers, springs, and animal herds. During favourable periods, mammals moved between Africa and Eurasia in both directions. Hominins were part of these faunal exchanges, following resources through corridors that could remain usable for generations and then close as aridity returned. Fossils and tools suggest that early Homo spread rapidly after entering Western Asia. By around 1.6 million years ago, hominins were present in parts of eastern and southeastern Asia. Fossils from Java, traditionally assigned to Homo erectus, reveal a lineage that survived there for an extraordinary span of time. Evidence from China is more fragmented and often debated, but stone tools and human remains indicate repeated occupations reaching deep into the early Pleistocene. These populations encountered monsoon systems, temperate winters, volcanic islands, unfamiliar predators, and plant communities unlike those of Africa. Their success did not require complete independence from warm climates. Many early Eurasian sites lie within regions that periodically offered relatively mild conditions. Expansion may have occurred during favourable windows rather than through an immediate conquest of every environment. Cold northern interiors, high mountains, and extreme deserts remained formidable. Populations could advance when climates improved and retreat or disappear when conditions deteriorated. The archaeological record often captures presence without continuity. Homo erectus became the first human lineage with a truly transcontinental range, but even that name may conceal several related populations. African fossils are sometimes called Homo ergaster to distinguish them from Asian Homo erectus, though many specialists include both within one variable species. The distinction reflects real anatomical differences, but whether those differences deserve separate species names remains unresolved. Evolution across a wide range would naturally produce regional variation as populations became isolated and adapted to local conditions. Achillean hand axes spread into parts of Eurasia after their appearance in Africa, yet they did not occur everywhere. East Asian sites often lack the classic hand axe forms found in Africa, the Levant, and Western Eurasia. Earlier explanations treated this as evidence of cognitive difference, but raw material, local traditions, mobility, and tool function may provide better explanations. Populations could solve similar problems with different technologies. A missing artifact type does not prove a missing mental ability. Some outward expansions left little genetic legacy. Ancient populations could survive for tens or hundreds of thousands of years and still vanish completely. Small groups were especially vulnerable to climate change and isolation. If a population remained cut off from others, declining numbers could erase both genes and cultural traditions. Later migrants might occupy the same region without descending directly from those who came before. Eurasia therefore became a landscape of repeated human arrivals, not one continuous settlement beginning with the first departure. Much later, populations descended from African Homo gave rise to Neanderthals in Western Eurasia and Denisovans somewhere farther east. Their exact origins remain difficult to trace because the fossil and genetic records do not align perfectly. They shared a common ancestral population with Homo sapiens, probably rooted in Africa before branches became established across Eurasia. The later existence of Neanderthals and Denisovans outside Africa does not contradict an African foundation for human origins. It reflects the diversification of African-derived populations after expansion. Within Africa, other lineages continued evolving. Fossils from sites across the continent reveal populations with mixtures of ancient and more recent traits during the Middle Pleistocene. Some are associated with names such as Homo heidelbergensis, Homo rhodesiensis, or archaic Homo sapiens, though the classifications remain unstable. The record suggests a continent occupied by multiple regional populations that sometimes became separated and later reconnected. One or more of these interconnected African lineages eventually contributed to the emergence of Homo sapiens. Our own species also left Africa more than once. Fossils from the Levant show Homo sapiens present outside the continent well before the major expansion that later populated much of the world. Remains from Mislia Cave in Israel may date to around 180,000 years ago, while fossils from School and Kafze indicate populations in the region roughly 90,000 to 130,000 years ago. These early movements appear to have been limited or temporary. Their descendants may have contributed little to later populations, although the evidence remains incomplete. Arabia, often imagined as an empty desert, repeatedly became greener during humid periods. Lakes formed, rivers flowed, and grasslands supported animals and humans moving between Africa and Asia. Stone tools and fossils indicate that several human populations entered the peninsula during these windows. When aridity returned, groups may have retreated, become isolated, or disappeared. The corridor opened and closed many times, creating false starts rather than one decisive migration. The major expansion of Homo sapiens beyond Africa occurred much later, especially after about 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Even this was probably not one synchronized event. Different populations moved along different routes, entered regions already occupied by other humans, and sometimes interbred with them. Most living people with ancestry outside Africa carry a small proportion of Neanderthal DNA, while some populations in Asia and Oceania also preserve Denisovan ancestry. These genetic traces reveal encounters that fossils alone could never have shown. Yet the success of later dispersals depended on developments that had taken place within Africa. Before expanding widely, Homo sapiens populations had already occupied forests, grasslands, coasts, highlands, deserts, and lake systems. Research increasingly suggests that the human ecological niche broadened within Africa before the most successful global migrations. People learned to survive across a wider range of habitats, drawing on flexible technologies, social networks, food strategies, and inherited environmental knowledge. Leaving Africa was therefore not the beginning of human adaptability. It was one consequence of adaptability developed over a much longer African history. The bodies that crossed into Eurasia had been shaped by millions of years of evolution on the continent. The cultures that helped later migrants survive were assembled within African populations that had repeatedly faced environmental change, separation, and renewed contact. The phrase "out of Africa" can create the misleading impression of a completed exit, as though humanity departed its place of origin and left it behind. In reality, most humans remained in Africa through every early migration. Populations within the continent continued to diversify, interact, and innovate. Some later movements may even have carried people and genes back into Africa from Eurasia. Migration was multidirectional, and the boundaries between regions were never absolute. Eurasia preserves important chapters of the human story: the endurance of Homo erectus, the worlds of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and the encounters that followed the arrival of Homo sapiens. But those chapters begin downstream from a much deeper source. Every early traveller beyond the continent belonged to a lineage formed in Africa, and every successful expansion rested upon adaptations already tested there. The outward journeys widened the human world. They did not replace the continent that had generated its oldest branches. For most of the history of human origins research, fossils carried nearly the entire burden of explanation. A skull could reveal the shape of a face, the size of a brain, and the position of muscle attachments. Teeth could suggest diet and evolutionary relationships. Limb bones could preserve traces of walking, climbing, growth, and injury. Stone tools could show that someone had struck, cut, carried, or processed material at a particular place. Yet every fossil was a survivor of extraordinary chance. Most bodies disappeared without a trace. Most populations left no skeleton anyone has found. Entire regions seemed empty because heat, moisture, acidic soils, erosion, burial, and later geology had erased the evidence. Genetics introduced a different archive. Instead of beginning with the dead, scientists could examine variation among the living and ask how deeply different lineages separated, when populations expanded or contracted, and which groups exchanged ancestry. DNA did not replace fossils. It revealed dimensions of the past that bones alone could not preserve, while creating new problems of interpretation. A genome is not a complete family history written in plain language. It is a layered record shaped by mutation, recombination, migration, natural selection, population size, and chance. The first broad genetic studies already pointed strongly toward Africa. Human genetic diversity is greatest within African populations, while populations outside Africa carry only a subset of that variation. This pattern is what scientists expect when a smaller portion of a larger population moves away and establishes new communities elsewhere. The migrants carry some ancestral variation with them, but not all of it. Over time, additional population bottlenecks can reduce diversity further. The result is a nested pattern in which non-African variation largely represents branches emerging from within a deeper African structure. This does not mean that Africa contains one ancient population from which everyone else simply split. The continent holds the greatest internal diversity precisely because populations there separated, adapted, declined, expanded, and mixed over very long periods. Two African populations can differ from one another across deep stretches of ancestry that predate the major migration beyond the continent. Genetic distance does not translate into cultural distance, biological hierarchy, or different levels of modernity. Every living person belongs to the same species, and all living populations have continued evolving. What differs is the history of population structure preserved in their genomes. Mitochondrial DNA provided one of the earliest influential clues, because it is inherited primarily through the maternal line and does not recombine in the same way as most nuclear DNA. Researchers could compare mutations and estimate relationships among maternal lineages. The deepest surviving branches were found in Africa, suggesting that the most recent common maternal ancestor of all living humans lived there. Popular accounts sometimes turned this statistical ancestor into a lone woman, the supposed mother of humanity. The reality is less theatrical. She lived among many other people, many of whom also have descendants today through other lines of ancestry. Her mitochondrial lineage is simply the one from which all surviving mitochondrial lineages eventually descend. The Y chromosome offered a broadly similar paternal record, though estimates changed as more populations were sampled. Its deepest surviving lineages also point to Africa. These maternal and paternal markers were powerful but incomplete. Each traces only one narrow line through an enormous family tree. A person has two parents, 4 grandparents, and rapidly multiplying numbers of genealogical ancestors farther back, while mitochondrial DNA follows only one maternal root and the Y chromosome only one paternal root. The rest of the genome preserves a far richer and more tangled history. Whole genome studies transform the picture. Instead of one lineage, researchers could examine millions of genetic positions and model how populations related over time. These analyses strengthen the African origin of Homo sapiens while weakening the idea of a single, isolated birthplace. Patterns of shared variation suggest that ancestral populations across Africa remained partly separated yet continued exchanging genes. Some lineages diverge for long periods, then mixed again. Others contributed more ancestry to later populations. The origin of Homo sapiens increasingly resembles a network of rivers joining and separating across a broad landscape rather than one narrow stream beginning at a single spring. This network is difficult to reconstruct because modern genomes have been reshaped repeatedly. Population expansions can overwhelm older signals. Migration can connect groups that were once distant. Natural selection can make one variant spread rapidly, while genetic drift can erase another by chance. Later movements within Africa, including migrations associated with herding, farming, trade, and language expansion, redistributed ancestry across large areas. The genomes of living populations preserve deep history, but they also preserve every later chapter written on top of it. Ancient DNA offers a way to examine some of those earlier layers more directly. In cool environments, genetic material can survive in bone for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. Africa presents harsher conditions. Heat and humidity break DNA into tiny fragments, while microbes and water accelerate decay. For years, this created an imbalance. Ancient genomes from Europe and Northern Asia accumulated rapidly, while the continent central to human origins remained poorly represented. New laboratory methods are beginning to reduce that gap. Researchers can recover shorter fragments, target the densest parts of bones and teeth, and distinguish ancient molecules from contamination. Genomes from southern Africa have become especially important because some regions preserve remains better than tropical zones. A recent study of 28 ancient individuals spanning roughly 10,000 years revealed ancestry patterns that are no longer fully represented in living populations. These genomes showed that southern Africa preserved deep branches of Homo sapiens diversity, while also experiencing repeated population change. The finding is sometimes described through the idea of a refugium, a region where populations survived climatic or ecological disruption, while other areas became less habitable. Southern Africa may indeed have sheltered ancient lineages during difficult intervals, but the term can imply more stability than the evidence supports. Populations there moved, mixed, and changed. The region was not a sealed museum of early humanity. It was one of several parts of Africa where old genetic structure persisted long enough to leave detectable traces. Ancient DNA also reveals how much has been lost. Some populations represented in old genomes may have no unmixed modern equivalent. Their ancestry survives only in small proportions distributed among later groups, or perhaps not at all. This mirrors the fossil record, where entire species are known from a handful of fragments. Human history is full of populations that were once complete worlds and are now visible only as statistical signals. Genetics has also exposed contact with other kinds of humans. Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in living non-African populations proved that Homo sapiens interbred with archaic humans after leaving Africa. Within Africa, researchers have identified patterns that may reflect mixture with deeply separated African populations, sometimes described as ghost lineages. No confirmed fossils or ancient genomes have yet identified these groups directly. The signals could represent unknown archaic humans, long-separated Homo sapiens populations, or limitations in current models. Scholars still debate the best explanation, and no single genetic reconstruction should be treated as final. One major problem remains representation. African populations are still dramatically undersampled in global genetic databases. The continent contains extraordinary linguistic, cultural, and biological diversity, yet many large studies rely heavily on people of European ancestry. This limits both medical research and the reconstruction of human origins. A model built from incomplete sampling can mistake absence of data for absence of history. Projects designed to expand African genome representation are therefore more than technical exercises. They can reveal variants found nowhere else, refine population models, and correct assumptions created by narrow datasets. Just as importantly, they raise questions about leadership, consent, data ownership, benefit sharing, and the role of African institutions. The genetic history of Africa cannot ethically be treated as a resource to extract while local researchers and communities remain secondary. When fossils and genomes are placed together, they rarely align perfectly, but their disagreements are productive. Fossils show bodies in particular places. Genetics shows relationships that may span regions with no surviving bone. Archaeology records behavior, while DNA records ancestry. A fossil from Morocco can suggest an early population near the base of the Homo sapiens lineage. Genomes from southern Africa can preserve deep variation unseen in that fossil. Remains from Ethiopia can show anatomically modern traits, while genetic models imply continuing connections across the continent. The combined evidence does not identify one birthplace. It identifies Africa as a continent-wide evolutionary system. Bodies changed in different regions, populations separated and rejoined. Some traits spread through interbreeding. Others evolved locally or disappeared. The genetic record confirms the African foundation of our species, while making that foundation more complex than any single fossil site could reveal. Every living genome carries a small, reorganized portion of this immense past. Most of it cannot be traced to a named population or excavated site. Yet beneath recent ancestry lie older patterns formed when deserts opened. Forests shifted, lakes expanded, and groups moved across routes now erased. Fossils made scientists look toward Africa. Genetics showed that they had not been looking widely enough within it. The genetic record does more than confirm an African origin. It changes the shape of that origin. For much of the 20th century, researchers often searched for one region that could be called the birthplace of Homo sapiens. East Africa seemed the strongest candidate because of fossils from Ethiopia and the depth of the Rift Valley record. Later discoveries in Morocco drew attention northward. Southern Africa contributed its own early anatomy, archaeological traditions, and deep genetic lineages. Each new region appeared to compete for the title of cradle. The growing evidence now suggests that the competition itself may be based on the wrong idea. A species spread across a continent does not need to begin in one small place. Homo sapiens may have emerged through interactions among several African populations, separated enough to develop distinctive traits, yet connected often enough to exchange genes, technologies, and behaviors. In this model, no single group contained the complete modern human package from the beginning. Different populations may have contributed different parts of the anatomy and genetic structure later seen across our species: faces, skull shapes, brain organization, bodies, technologies, and social systems did not necessarily become modern at the same time or in the same region. Geneticists describe one influential version of this history as a weakly structured stem. The phrase is technical, but the underlying idea is simple. Instead of one ancestral population splitting neatly into later branches, several related populations existed across Africa over long periods. They were not completely isolated. Migration and interbreeding connected them, though those connections may have weakened or strengthened as climates changed. A desert could separate regions for thousands of years. A wetter phase could reopen grassland and river corridors. Populations that had developed partly independently could meet again, exchanging ancestry before separating once more. This repeated contact creates a genetic pattern unlike a simple tree. A tree divides into branches that never rejoin. Human populations often behave more like a braided river. Channels separate around barriers, flow apart, then merge downstream. One channel may carry more water for a time, while another narrows but does not vanish. Sediment from several sources becomes mixed, making it difficult to identify one point as the beginning of the river. The metaphor is imperfect, but it captures why modern genetic models can reject a single isolated origin without denying that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. The continent's geography makes such a system plausible. The Sahara repeatedly alternated between dry desert and greener landscapes crossed by lakes and rivers. Eastern Africa contained highlands, rift basins, and shifting lake systems that could isolate neighbouring groups. Central forests expanded during wetter intervals and contracted during drier ones, changing routes between east, west, and south. Major river systems offered corridors while also forming barriers. Southern refugees could preserve populations during periods when interior regions became less hospitable. Coastal routes shifted with sea level, exposing plains that are now submerged. Population structure would have followed these changes. During favourable periods, groups could expand, meeting others over broad territories. During harsher intervals, they may have contracted into areas with dependable water, plant foods, game, or coastal resources. Isolation did not need to last long enough to produce separate species. Even several thousand years of reduced contact could allow differences to accumulate through selection and chance. When movement resumed, those differences could enter a larger shared population through interbreeding. Fossils increasingly fit this network better than they fit a single birthplace. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco preserves early Homo sapiens remains around 300,000 years old. These individuals possessed faces that appear surprisingly modern in several respects, while their brain cases retained a longer, more archaic shape. In Eastern Africa, Omo 1 shows a different combination, including a more modern cranial form, though its exact age and geological context required repeated revision. Herto, also in Ethiopia, preserves robust humans with many modern features, but not an anatomy identical to people living today. Southern African fossils add further combinations, some more gracile, some retaining traits that resist simple classification. None of these populations looks like a perfect first modern human. That may be precisely the point. The earliest Homo sapiens record is a mosaic distributed across the continent. A modern-looking face appears in one region. A more rounded brain case appears elsewhere. Behavioral evidence develops unevenly across multiple archaeological traditions. The traits eventually found together in later humans may have accumulated through exchange among populations rather than appearing as one sudden biological event. The recent fossils from Casablanca push this complexity deeper in time. At around 773,000 years old, they predate Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years. yet their anatomy has been interpreted as belonging near the base of the lineage that would eventually lead to our species. They do not prove that modern humans began in Morocco. Instead, they show that North Africa contained important populations during a period often poorly represented in the fossil record. The ancestry of Homo sapiens may have extended across regions that were once treated as peripheral. Eastern Africa remains essential, but not exclusive. Its volcanic layers allow unusually precise dating, and its exposed sediments preserve a long sequence from early hominins through later Homo. This richness can create the illusion that evolutionary events occurred there simply because more evidence survives. Fossils from regions without volcanic ash, dramatic erosion, or long excavation histories may remain hidden. The map of discoveries is shaped by geology and research investment as much as by ancient population density. Western and Central Africa represent the largest silence. Humid environments destroy bone and DNA quickly, while forests conceal exposed sediments. Yet these regions occupy enormous areas and contain ecological zones that could have supported human populations through many climatic phases. Stone tools, genetic signals, and the recent evidence of early forest occupation indicate that they cannot be treated as empty spaces. A Pan-African model must include places where direct fossils are currently rare. The evidence from tropical Côte d'Ivoire is especially important. Archaeological deposits indicate that humans associated with the Homo sapiens lineage were using wet forest environments around 150,000 years ago. This was not supposed to fit the older story. Dense rainforest was often imagined as a late frontier because its scattered foods, poor visibility, disease burden, and difficult travel seem to require highly developed technology. The discovery suggests that early humans were already capable of living within such habitats much earlier, and that Western Africa may have preserved populations whose bones are almost entirely gone. Southern Africa contributes a different archive. Its caves and rock shelters preserve long archaeological sequences, while ancient genomes reveal lineages of exceptional depth. Some southern populations may have remained partly isolated for long periods, preserving ancestry that later became rare or disappeared, yet they were not disconnected from the rest of the continent forever. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows repeated movement into and out of the region. Southern Africa was both refuge and crossroads, depending on the period. Networks of contact do not require constant continent-wide travel. Most individuals probably spent their lives within comparatively limited territories. Connections could operate through neighboring groups, a toolmaking technique, ornament style, raw material, or genetic variant could move gradually across hundreds of kilometers through repeated local exchanges. Over generations, a chain of contacts could connect populations whose members never met directly. Culture and ancestry could spread farther than any one person travelled. Such exchanges may explain why behavioural innovations appear in scattered places and then sometimes disappear. Pigments, engraved objects, specialised hunting tools, ornaments, and complex stoneworking emerge at different times in different African regions. Older accounts searched for one behavioural revolution, a sudden awakening that created modern minds. The archaeological record looks more uneven. Innovations appear locally, persist for a time, vanish, and later reappear elsewhere. Small populations may have lost practices when networks weakened. Larger connected populations could preserve and combine knowledge more effectively. This means that population contact may have shaped cognition and culture as much as environment did. A larger social network gives individuals access to more information, materials, and potential partners. It can protect communities from local shortages and reduce the risk that rare skills disappear. When networks break down, cultural complexity can contract even if human biological capacities remain unchanged. What survives in the record suggests that modern behavior was not unlocked by one mutation. It accumulated through demographic and social systems distributed across Africa. The weakly structured stem model remains a model, not a final reconstruction. Genetic results depend on assumptions about mutation rates, population size, migration, and which modern populations are sampled. Ancient African genomes remain rare, especially from periods close to the origin of Homo sapiens. Fossils are incomplete, and anatomical similarities can arise through shared ancestry, interbreeding, or parallel evolution. Scholars still debate how many populations were involved, where they lived, and how strongly they were connected. Even so, the single cradle image is becoming harder to defend. Africa increasingly appears not as one birthplace, but as a continent of interacting homelands. North Africa, Eastern Rift regions, southern refuges, tropical forests, coasts, and interior corridors all may have contributed to the long formation of our species. The oldest humans who looked partly like us were not waiting in one valley to replace everyone else. They were members of a shifting network, carrying different pieces of a shared future. That future emerged slowly. Faces became more modern before some brain cases did. Technologies grew more varied without advancing in one direction. Populations mixed without losing every regional difference. Homo sapiens formed through connection as much as separation. The species was not born in isolation. It was assembled across a continent. If Homo sapiens was assembled across Africa rather than born in one place, then the earliest fossils of our species should look exactly as confusing as they do. They should share some traits with living humans while retaining others inherited from older populations. They should appear in different regions at different dates, with no single specimen carrying every feature regarded as modern. This is the pattern preserved in Morocco, Ethiopia, and other parts of the continent. The oldest candidates do not stand in a neat sequence. They form a scattered constellation of faces, skulls, jaws, and teeth that seem to approach modern humanity from several directions at once. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco has become central to this puzzle. The site lies west of the Atlas Mountains, far from the East African locations that dominated earlier accounts of human origins. Fossils were first discovered there during mining operations in the 1960s and were initially thought to be much younger, perhaps belonging to a North African form of Neanderthal. Later excavations recovered additional human remains, stone tools, and evidence of burning. Improved dating placed the occupation at approximately 300,000 years ago. Making the fossils among the oldest remains widely assigned to Homo sapiens. The Jebel Irhoud individuals possess faces that can look unexpectedly familiar. Their brow ridges are pronounced, yet the facial structure is relatively short and positioned beneath the front of the brain case rather than projecting strongly forward. The teeth and jaws also fall broadly within the range associated with early Homo sapiens. If reconstructed without the back of the skull, the face might not appear dramatically different from that of a robust person living much later. The brain case tells another story. It is long and low rather than high and rounded. Living humans possess a more globular skull, with changes in the parietal and cerebellar regions that reflect differences in brain organization and development. Jebel Irhoud therefore combines a face approaching the modern condition with a brain case retaining an older shape. The individuals were not simply modern people with heavy brows. They belonged to an early population in which some features of Homo sapiens had emerged while others were still developing. This anatomical mixture weakens the idea that the species appeared suddenly as a complete package. Facial reorganization may have preceded the evolution of the rounded brain case characteristic of later humans. Changes in brain shape could have continued for tens of thousands of years after recognizable Homo sapiens faces appeared. Brain size alone does not explain the transition, because some archaic humans possessed brains as large as or larger than the modern average. The important shift may have involved internal organization, developmental timing, and connectivity features that skulls preserve only indirectly. The tools found at Jebel Irhoud belong to the Middle Stone Age, a broad technological world characterized by prepared core methods. Toolmakers shaped a core so that a desired flake could be removed with a planned strike. This required more control than producing a simple older-one edge, though it did not mean every tool was complex or standardized. Some stone had been heated, likely through fires used near the site. The association of fossils and technology shows that these early humans were already participating in behavioral traditions spread across parts of Africa. But the site does not provide evidence for every practice later linked with modern human culture. Far to the east, the fossils from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia present a different arrangement. Omo 1, recovered in the late 1960s, possesses a high cranial vault, reduced brow ridges, and a distinct chin, features that place it comfortably within Homo sapiens. Volcanic evidence has revised its minimum age several times. The fossil is now understood to be older than a major eruption dated to roughly 233,000 years ago, though its precise age remains uncertain. Omo may therefore be substantially younger than Jebel Irhoud, but its anatomy appears more recognizably modern. Another individual from the same formation, Omo 2, is more robust and retains a longer, lower skull shape. The contrast between Omo 1 and Omo 2 has generated debate over whether they represent variation within one population, individuals from different periods, or a more complex pattern of regional diversity. Their exact relationship remains unresolved. What matters is that Eastern Africa also preserves a mixture of traits rather than a uniform early Homo sapiens form. The sediments surrounding Omo Kibish reveal a landscape repeatedly altered by rivers, volcanic eruptions, and changing lake conditions. These events help preserve and date the fossils, but they also remind us that the people represented there lived within dynamic environments. Populations could move along river systems, gather near water during dry periods, and become isolated when landscapes shifted. The fossils are snapshots taken from a much longer sequence of movement and contact. At Herto, in Ethiopia's Middle Awash region, 3 skulls dated to around 160,000 years ago preserve another early population. Their anatomy is clearly close to Homo sapiens, yet the skulls are large and robust, with strong brow ridges and heavy cranial structure. They were once assigned the subspecies name Homo sapiens idaltu to emphasize their combination of modern and archaic traits. Many researchers now prefer to avoid formal subspecies divisions, but the fossils remain important because they appear anatomically intermediate between older African populations and later humans. The Herto remains also carry cut marks and polished surfaces. These modifications have been interpreted as evidence that the skulls were deliberately handled after death, perhaps as part of mortuary treatment. The exact meaning is impossible to recover. The marks need not indicate violence or cannibalism, and they should not be forced into a modern ritual category. They show that the bodies of the dead were sometimes treated in ways extending beyond ordinary decomposition. This is a rare glimpse of behavior that stone tools alone cannot reveal, though the evidence remains open to several interpretations. Other African fossils fill the space between these famous sites. Florisbad in South Africa preserves a partial skull around 260,000 years old with a mixture of Homo sapiens-like and archaic traits. Gwomdi in Kenya, Elia Springs, Ngaloba in Tanzania, and remains from several North and East African locations add further variation. Some specimens are difficult to date. Others are too incomplete for secure classification. Their names and positions on the family tree have changed repeatedly as researchers compare them with new discoveries. The problem is intensified by the label Homo sapiens itself. Species boundaries are easier to define among living animals whose bodies, genes, behavior, and reproduction can be observed. Fossil species must be reconstructed from incomplete morphology. If neighbouring ancient populations exchange genes, then no sharp anatomical boundary may have existed. A fossil can be close to our ancestry without fitting every modern criterion. Another may possess a modern-looking skull yet belong to a regional branch that contributed little to later people. For this reason, the phrase earliest Homo sapiens can refer to several different things. It may mean the oldest fossil with any diagnostic trait of our species, the oldest specimen with a mostly modern anatomy, the oldest population genetically ancestral to living humans, or the oldest individual that would look unremarkable among people today. These categories do not necessarily point to the same date or place. Recent fossils from Casablanca extend the puzzle farther backward, at roughly 773,000 years old. They do not belong to Homo sapiens, yet their anatomy has been interpreted as close to the population from which our lineage emerged. This places North Africa within the deeper ancestry of modern humans long before Jebel Irhoud. It also reduces the likelihood that the decisive ancestral population developed entirely in Eurasia before returning to Africa. The Casablanca fossils do not identify a direct ancestor, but they strengthen the case for an African lineage extending through the poorly understood middle of the Pleistocene. This period between about 1 million and 300,000 years ago remains one of the least resolved stretches of human evolution. Fossils are scarce, often fragmentary, and distributed unevenly. Names such as Homo heidelbergensis and Homo rhodesiensis have been applied inconsistently to African and Eurasian specimens. Some researchers prefer regional descriptions rather than forcing diverse fossils into one species. Others seek a broader classification that acknowledges shared ancestry. No single explanation fully accounts for the variation. The puzzle may never yield a first individual who can be called the founder of humanity. Species emerge across populations, not in one dramatic birth. Parents and offspring belong to continuous generations, even while anatomy changes gradually over thousands of years. The boundary drawn by scientists is therefore retrospective. It marks a region within a long transformation, rather than one moment when an archaic human suddenly became modern. Jebel Irhoud supplies the early face. Omo 1 offers a more rounded skull and clear chin. Herto preserves robust early sapiens anatomy. Other African sites fill the spaces with different combinations. None is the entire answer. Together they reveal a species taking shape unevenly across a continent, connected by ancestry, but divided by distance, climate, and time. The mystery is not which fossil deserves to be crowned the first human. It is how these scattered populations became parts of one evolving network whose descendants would eventually carry a shared anatomy across the world. The scattered fossils do not disagree because one of them must be wrong. They disagree because human origins may have been genuinely distributed across time and space. Yet science cannot stop at saying the past was complicated. Researchers need model simplified explanations that organize evidence, generate predictions, and reveal where new discoveries might overturn old assumptions. Several models have competed to explain the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa. None captures every detail, and the differences between them are sometimes narrower than their names suggest. Each begins with the same broad fact: the deepest fossil and genetic foundations of living humanity lie in Africa. The dispute concerns how many populations were involved, how isolated they were, and whether one region contributed far more than all others. The simplest explanation is a single origin model within Africa. In its strongest form, it proposes that Homo sapiens evolved from one relatively small ancestral population concentrated in a particular region, most often Eastern Africa. That population developed the key anatomical and behavioral features of our species, expanded across the continent, and largely replaced or absorbed other African humans before some descendants moved into Eurasia. This model once seemed attractive because Eastern Africa preserved an exceptional fossil record. Omo Kibish, Herto, long archaeological sequences, datable volcanic layers, and older hominin discoveries all suggested continuity within a region already known to be central to human evolution. A single source population also fits certain genetic patterns. All living humans share relatively recent common ancestry compared with many other widespread species. Population bottlenecks, expansions, and replacement can produce branching patterns that appear to converge on a limited ancestral group. A localized origin is therefore not biologically impossible. Small populations can spread rapidly when they possess favorable technologies, social networks, or ecological flexibility. The difficulty is identifying the supposed center. Eastern Africa has strong evidence, but Jebel Irhoud places early Homo sapiens anatomy in Morocco, around 300,000 years ago. Southern Africa preserves important fossils, archaeological traditions, and exceptionally deep genetic lineages. Casablanca extends a potentially relevant North African lineage back to about 773,000 years ago. Western and Central Africa remain poorly represented by fossils, yet archaeology and genetics suggest ancient populations lived there. As discoveries widened geographically, the single cradle began to move around the map. A birthplace that shifts with every major excavation may reflect the distribution of evidence more than the distribution of ancient people. A softer version of the single origin model remains possible. One population could have contributed most of the ancestry of living humans while interacting with neighboring African groups. The source need not have been completely isolated, and the region need not have remained fixed through time. Populations can move. A lineage centered in Eastern Africa during one period might expand north or south, mix with residents, and later leave its strongest fossil signal elsewhere. This makes the model harder to disprove, but also brings it closer to the network explanations that increasingly dominate discussion. At the opposite historical extreme lies classical multi-regional evolution. In its older global form, this model proposed that populations descended from early Homo erectus evolved toward modern humans in Africa, Europe, and Asia over long periods, while gene flow between regions kept them part of one species. Regional anatomical continuity was treated as evidence that modern people in different parts of the world descended substantially from local archaic populations. Genetic evidence has largely rejected the strongest form of this global model. Living non-African populations derive most of their ancestry from Homo sapiens populations that expanded out of Africa relatively recently. Neanderthals and Denisovans contributed small but important proportions through interbreeding, yet they were not the primary ancestors of modern Europeans, Asians, or Oceanians. Regional continuity outside Africa exists mainly as limited admixture rather than uninterrupted local transformation from Homo erectus into living populations. This does not make interbreeding unimportant. The older replacement model, in which Homo sapiens left Africa and completely eliminated every archaic population without genetic exchange, was also too simple. Ancient DNA demonstrated that expanding humans met and reproduced with Neanderthals and Denisovans. The result is sometimes called an assimilation model. Recent African origins remain central, but limited ancestry from other human lineages survives within living people. Replacement occurred demographically, yet it was not absolute. Within Africa, a different kind of multi-regionalism has gained influence. The Pan-African model proposes that Homo sapiens emerged through populations distributed across several parts of the continent. These groups experienced periods of isolation, but remained connected by intermittent movement and interbreeding. Anatomical and behavioral traits arose in different places and were gradually assembled through population contact. Unlike classical global multi-regionalism, this model does not claim that modern populations in each region evolved continuously from local Homo erectus. It describes a network within Africa during the formation of our species. The fossil record gives the Pan-African model much of its appeal. Early Homo sapiens remains appear across a huge geographical range and display different mixtures of traits. Morocco contributes a modern-looking face with an elongated brain case. Ethiopia provides fossils with more globular skulls and clear chins, as well as robust early sapiens forms. Southern Africa adds specimens that resist placement into one linear sequence, rather than arranging these fossils from primitive to advanced. The Pan-African interpretation treats them as regional populations participating in one broad evolutionary process. Archaeology adds another layer. Middle Stone Age technologies occur across Africa, but local traditions differ in raw materials, tool forms, and timing. Pigment use, engraved objects, projectile technologies, ornaments, and intensive coastal adaptation appear unevenly. Some practices emerge, disappear, and return. This pattern does not resemble one behavioral revolution radiating instantly from a single birthplace. It suggests local innovation within populations whose connections strengthened or weakened over time. The weakly structured stem model offers a more precise genetic version of this idea. It proposes that the ancestors of living humans were not one completely unified population, nor several deeply isolated species. Instead, they consisted of related populations with limited but recurring gene flow. Their separations were substantial enough to create structure, yet not strong enough to prevent later mixing. Over hundreds of thousands of years, ancestry flowed through this network until the differences among its branches became incorporated into later Homo sapiens populations. This model can explain genetic patterns that once seemed to require mysterious archaic interbreeding within Africa. Deeply divergent DNA segments in living Africans have sometimes been interpreted as evidence that Homo sapiens mixed with unknown archaic humans. Such ghost populations may have existed. Africa certainly contained human lineages whose fossils remain undiscovered. Yet some genetic signals could instead emerge from long-standing structure among ancestral Homo sapiens populations. If groups separated for extended periods and later mixed, their DNA might resemble admixture between distinct species even when the populations belong to one evolving network. The distinction is difficult to resolve without ancient genomes from the relevant periods. DNA older than 100,000 years is exceptionally rare in most African environments. Genetic models must infer extinct populations from living people whose ancestry has been reshaped by later migrations. Different demographic scenarios can sometimes produce similar patterns. A weakly structured stem, mixture with archaic African humans, or combinations of both may fit parts of the same data. Scholars still debate how much separation occurred and whether some contributors were distinct enough to deserve different species names. Geography also remains uncertain. A Pan-African origin does not mean every region contributed equally. Some populations may have provided much more ancestry than others. Certain areas may have served as long-term refuges, while others were occupied only during favourable climatic windows. North Africa could connect with the Levant during humid phases, but become isolated by desert during arid ones. Eastern highlands and rift basins could preserve separate communities within relatively short distances. Central forests might divide populations or shelter them. Southern coastal plains, many now submerged, may have supported communities barely visible in the surviving record. The models therefore form a spectrum rather than three sealed boxes. At one end lies a dominant source population with limited outside contribution. At the other lies a broad continental network with no single demographic centre. Between them are many possibilities, one major population repeatedly absorbing neighbours, several regional populations contributing unequally, or a shifting network whose centre changed with climate and migration. Current evidence favours substantial structure and interaction across Africa, but it cannot yet measure every contribution. The Pan-African framework explains the geographical spread of fossils and the mosaic appearance of early Homo sapiens particularly well. The weakly structured stem model offers a plausible genetic mechanism, yet a strong demographic contribution from one region remains possible, and future fossils or ancient DNA could reveal periods when one population expanded dramatically through the continent. Science advances here not by choosing the most dramatic cradle, but by asking what each model predicts. A single origin model should leave signs of a sharp expansion from one population. A Pan-African network should produce regional anatomical mosaics, deep genetic structure, and repeated contact. Archaic admixture should leave DNA segments diverging earlier than expected, and perhaps fossils representing the contributing lineages. New discoveries can then strengthen, modify, or reject parts of each explanation. The emerging answer is less tidy than the old family tree, but more human. Our species may not descend from one isolated community carrying every defining feature. It may descend from populations that survived by reconnecting groups separated by deserts, forests, rivers, and long climatic intervals, yet never permanently beyond one another's reach. The remaining question is not whether Africa formed Homo sapiens. It is how this immense network became coherent enough to leave the continent, meet other humans, and eventually become the ancestry of everyone alive. The coherence did not come from uniformity. It came from flexibility, exchange, and the survival of enough connected populations to carry their knowledge beyond local crises. By the time Homo sapiens began expanding widely outside Africa, the species had already spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting within the continent. Human communities had occupied river valleys, open grasslands, wooded mosaics, highlands, coasts, dry interiors, and tropical forests. They had learned to alter stone in increasingly varied ways, to transport materials across long distances, to use pigments and ornaments, to share resources, and to maintain social ties beyond the smallest local group. These abilities did not appear together in one sudden awakening. They accumulated unevenly within populations that sometimes flourished, sometimes contracted, and sometimes disappeared. The expansion of the human ecological niche before the major dispersals was especially important. From around 70,000 years ago, archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens increasingly occupied a broader range of environments within Africa. This does not mean earlier humans had been confined to one habitat. Forest occupation, coastal use, upland movement, and adaptation to arid regions had much deeper roots. The later expansion appears to have intensified this versatility, combining older regional knowledge into a species capable of moving through environments that differed sharply from those of its immediate ancestors. Climate helped open routes, but it did not guarantee successful migration. During humid phases, the Sahara could support lakes, grasslands, and rivers. Arabia also experienced greener intervals, creating corridors between Africa and Western Asia. During dry phases, those routes narrowed into difficult passages or disappeared. Humans followed animals, water, shorelines, and familiar plant zones through these shifting landscapes. Some groups moved only short distances. Others crossed into regions from which their descendants would never return. Many early expansions failed. Homo sapiens reached the eastern Mediterranean long before the largest later dispersal, yet those populations appear to have vanished or contributed little to living people. Groups entered Arabia during repeated wet phases, then became isolated when deserts returned. Small migrant populations could be erased by drought, competition, disease, or simple demographic chance. The archaeological record preserves traces of arrival more easily than proof of long-term survival. The expansion that eventually transformed the world was therefore not the first attempt. It was one of several, launched by populations whose ecological and social systems proved unusually resilient. After roughly 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens spread through southern and eastern Asia, reached Sahel, entered Europe, and much later crossed into the Americas. The dates and routes remain debated, and the movement was never one clean wave. Different populations advanced at different times, sometimes following coastlines, sometimes rivers and interior grasslands, sometimes routes now submerged beneath rising seas. Wherever they travelled, they encountered human worlds already in existence. Neanderthals occupied Western Eurasia. Denisovans or Denisovan-related populations lived across parts of Asia, though their full range remains mysterious. Other regional lineages may have survived in places where fossils are scarce. Expanding Homo sapiens did not move through an empty continent. They entered landscapes shaped by people who'd adapted there for hundreds of thousands of years. These encounters were not purely replacements. Genetic evidence shows that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other human populations not yet identified from fossils. Most people with substantial ancestry outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Present-day populations in Oceania and parts of Asia preserve additional Denisovan ancestry, while smaller Denisovan contributions occur elsewhere. These fragments are not curiosities left at the edge of the genome. Some influenced immune responses, metabolism, skin biology, and adaptation to high altitude. One of the clearest examples appears among Tibetan populations, where a variant associated with survival at low oxygen levels derives from Denisovan-related ancestry. A genetic exchange that occurred tens of thousands of years ago helped later humans thrive on one of the world's highest plateaus. Other inherited variants may have been useful in past environments, but create disadvantages under modern diets or disease conditions. Genetic legacy is not a permanent gift or curse. Its effects depend on context. Interbreeding complicates the language of disappearance. Neanderthals and Denisovans no longer survive as distinct populations, but portions of their ancestry continue within living humans. Their disappearance was real at the cultural and demographic level. Their communities, traditions, and identities ended, yet they were not erased completely. Some became ancestors of the populations that expanded through their territories. The same may be true of vanished populations within Africa. Genetic models suggest deep ancestry from groups whose fossils have not been identified. These may represent long-separated Homo sapiens populations, unknown archaic humans, or several forms of population structure combined. The evidence remains incomplete. Africa's warm climates make ancient DNA exceptionally difficult to recover, so the continent's vanished human diversity is known mainly through indirect signals. Some ancestral populations may survive as small fragments distributed among living groups. Others may have disappeared without leaving any detectable trace. Modern African genetic diversity preserves the deepest surviving structure of Homo sapiens, but it should not be mistaken for frozen antiquity. Every African population has its own history of migration, mixture, adaptation, and change, pastoral expansions, farming movements, urban growth, trade routes, empires, and forced migrations reshaped ancestry across the continent. Populations speaking different languages exchanged genes and cultural practices. Communities expanded, divided, and absorbed neighbors. No living people can be treated as untouched representatives of the first humans. The same principle applies globally. Human populations differ in ancestry frequencies and local adaptations, but the overwhelming majority of genetic variation is shared. Traits such as skin pigmentation, body proportions, immune responses, and the ability to digest certain foods reflect relatively recent responses to climate, diet, disease, and culture. They occupy only a small part of the genome and do not divide humanity into ancient biological types. The deepest lesson of African origins is not that one modern population stands closer to humanity's beginning. It is that all living populations descend from an interconnected history whose earliest surviving branches were African. The phrase birthplace of humanity remains useful if it directs attention toward the continent where the human family first emerged. It becomes misleading when it suggests one nursery from which a finished species departed. Africa was not merely the place where humans were born before the important story happened elsewhere. Most of human evolution took place there. Upright walking developed there. Australopithecines diversified there. The earliest known Homo appeared there. Tool traditions deepened there. Homo sapiens formed there through populations spread across changing environments. The ecological flexibility behind later global expansion was tested there. Nor did African history become secondary after some people migrated outward. Populations within the continent continued to develop new technologies, economies, languages, and social worlds. Later exchanges moved in both directions. Some Eurasian ancestry returned to Africa. Crops, livestock, tools, and ideas crossed the same northeastern corridors that earlier humans had followed. Africa remained part of a connected human world, not a landscape abandoned by evolution. Why, then, do scientists look to Africa? They look because the oldest fossils of the human lineage are found there. They look because the record of bipedalism stretches deeper there than anywhere else. They look because the earliest members of Homo and the oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens are African. They look because living African populations preserve the greatest genetic diversity and the deepest ancestry of our species. They look because North, East, West, Central, and southern Africa each contain pieces that challenge the idea of one simple cradle. They also look because the continent continues to expose the limits of what is known. Vast regions remain underexplored. Tropical soils have erased bones. Ancient shorelines lie underwater. Political instability, funding inequality, and the legacy of colonial science have restricted research in many areas. Museum collections contain specimens awaiting reanalysis. New dating methods can transform the age of an old discovery. A single jaw from Morocco or a handful of teeth from Ethiopia can force the family tree to be redrawn. The future of this research will depend not only on new technology but on who directs it. African scientists, institutions, and communities are increasingly central to studying, preserving, and interpreting the continent's heritage. This is not simply a matter of representation. Local expertise, long-term training, ethical stewardship, and regional knowledge improve the science itself. Human origins research becomes stronger when Africa is treated not as a fossil field belonging to the world, but as a continent whose people have authority over how its past is investigated and told. No final fossil is waiting to complete the family tree. The tree itself may be the wrong shape. The deeper scientists look, the more human evolution resembles a shifting network of populations, sometimes isolated, sometimes connected, repeatedly transformed by climate, geography, culture, and chance. Modern humanity emerged from that network, carried outward by groups who survived not because they were the strongest in every setting, but because they could change how they lived. Every person alive is part of the aftermath of those changes. Some carry ancestry from populations that remained within Africa through nearly the entire history of Homo sapiens. Others descend largely from groups that passed through one of the continent's exits and entered Eurasia. Many carry genetic traces of encounters with Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other vanished people. Beneath all these differences lies a deeper connection to African populations whose names, languages, and appearances can never be recovered. The trail grows quiet at that depth. Fossils become rarer. Tools lose the hands that made them. Genetic branches fade into estimates and probabilities. Landscapes that once held lakes become desert. Forests cover old camps. Waves pass over coastal plains, where people once gathered food and watched the horizon. What remains is enough to show that humanity was never inevitable and never simple. Across millions of years, most hominin species disappeared. Their bodies were shaped for worlds that changed beyond their limits, or their populations became too small, or they were absorbed into others. Homo sapiens also came close to losses that cannot now be measured. Survival depended on refuges, remembered roots, shared food, learned skills, and renewed contact between groups separated by distance. The story begins to slow here, not because the mystery is solved, but because its scale becomes difficult to hold. The continent stretches beneath the present, carrying buried riverbeds, extinct lakes, caves sealed by stone, and sediments that have not seen light for hundreds of thousands of years. Somewhere within them are people who do not yet have names in science. Some may change the map again. Most will remain beyond recovery. Still, their presence can be felt in the pattern. Humanity did not rise from one perfect ancestor standing alone against the landscape. It emerged from communities, from mixture, from repeated movement, and from the ability to preserve knowledge through uncertainty. The human story survived because it was carried by many populations rather than entrusted to one. And so the oldest landscape in the human imagination is not one valley, one cave, or one patch of grassland. It is a continent changing under enormous skies, Rain falls where desert will one day stand. A lake reflects volcanic mountains. A small group follows a shoreline that no longer exists. They carry stone, food, memory, and one another's survival into the fading light. They do not know that they belong near the beginning of anything. They are simply living, adapting, and moving forward through a world that will erase almost every trace of them. Yet something passes on. A toolmaking habit, a route through dry country, a gesture understood by another person, a strand of ancestry carried into the next generation. The distances widen, the landscapes vanish, the names are lost, but the journey does not disappear. It continues quietly in every living human, carrying Africa within it.